A Dead God, Part 1. My name is Dr. Stephen Rolston, researcher at the Martian University of Creven. What follows aren't really research notes as much as they are a way of keeping me sane. I need them to truly grasp the magnitude of our discoveries, to keep the order in my mind, if you will. For as long as historians could remember, humanity had been looking for their God, but to no avail. Despite several millennium of searching, no deity was ever found. This never became a real issue, though, until the late 22nd century, when we invented the ships needed to explore space outside of our own solar system, the telescopes required to truly peek far into the universe and technology, allowing us to drill deep into the earth. Humanity had turned their eyes to the skies and to the planetary depths to look for answers. Neither heaven nor hell was ever found, however. Throughout the 23rd century, the disappointment grew, and a new church rose. Their priests preached about a dead God, believing that ours had somehow died. The religion had its major breakthrough in 2267, and by 2300, they had already converted over a third of the people to this new belief. The necrotic church had more power than it could ever need and grew stronger every year. My story begins a good 20 years later, however, with me waking up for another day of research. I aim to find a definitive answer to the age-old question, where is God? I refuse to believe he died. 24th August, 2322 AD. I decided to visit the observatory today. My research had been stale these past few weeks, and I felt I could use some new insights. There is only so much one can learn from the history books after all. It always strikes me as odd, though, whenever I talk to the scientists there, how we still have not discovered intelligent life. This in spite of our technological prowess and our planet colonizing habits. I feel it would be a solace, though. I guess I just do not want to be alone. Probably goes for all of us. To be honest, I would already settle for a few ruins, some scriptures perhaps, anything but the animalistic species that dominate every habitable planet we come across. I digress. There actually was an exciting new discovery made which my colleagues there told me about. They had discovered a new species of gaver-like creatures, albeit with much more flexibility in their claw-like fingers, deep in the bush forests of Titan Major. Apparently the beasts had exhibited an irrational fear of the explorers, but that was not the strange part. Although the creatures, Vedans Titan Arashiro, displayed no exceptional cognitive abilities, they had somehow crafted numerous human-like statues out of the thin wood found there. The statues vary greatly in size, from a few inches to close to 10 feet, but apart from gender differences, they are almost exactly the same. I do not know what to make of it. Adam and Eve? Eden? I need some sleep. 27th August, 2322 AD. I received a message from Gerald as I woke up today. He urged to call me back right away. Apparently he had been trying to reach my cell all night. After all those years, he still did not remember that I could not sleep with that thing turned on. Not that it mattered much these past few nights. My research will not let me sleep, and even if I do fall asleep, I have to face the nightmares. I will not be writing those down here, however, as it is best if I just forget them. But I digress. Eager to catch up, I called Gerald during breakfast. I did not think too much of his calls during the night back then, for he had done so before. "Good morning, Dr. Starr. I hope you slept well," I began. "What? Are you alone?" He promptly interrupted me. "Yes? Yes, I am." "Good. Well, Dr. Rolston, I have some good news for you," he said, sounding like his old self again. "If they have not brainwashed you yet, of course." "They do try," I laughed. "What news do you have?" "You should come back to Earth, Stephen. At least that church does not control everything here yet." He explained to me how there was a whole community of like-minded scientists in Tokyo, some of them atheists. Gerald gave me a contact number of one of the Martian members. From what I understood, the scientists were split into two research groups. One branch aimed to find heaven or any sign of God in the galaxy. The other held on to the belief that God lived inside all of us. It is a shame I know Gerald to be a firm believer of the latter, for it would be a pleasure to work together again. Searching the galaxy sounds like a much more exciting prospect, however. 30 August 2322 AD. Church confiscates alien artifacts, read the heading on the news website today. Can you believe that those priests actually did that? The first alien craftsmanship we ever found, and they are claiming it and probably burning it soon too. No scientist will be examining those wooden statues. On a more cheerful note, I finally met the other scientist Gerald had told me about. The Martian chapter operated in a state-of-the-art research facility on the crater plains near Craven. I was able to explore the entirety of it with chief researcher Dr. Havard as my guide. He explained to me how they had found several rich benefactors, mainly older religions, to take care of the financial aspect of their research. Most of the funding was used on the observatory, however, and it was magnificent. The telescopes there were unlike any I had ever seen before, both in scale and effectivity. Furthermore, Dr. Havard assured me that those were not even the most advanced models they had. In the hallway stood a number of brand new telescopes still wrapped up in their packaging, and several parts of a legitimately giant one laid scattered across the floor. I also took the opportunity to ask him about the news I heard today, though I now wish I had not. You heard the news today? I asked. About the church's latest confiscation. Yes, I did, he nodded, and I'm afraid there is even more to it than that. Come, walk with me. He led me through a series of highly secured doors into another wing of the research center that I had not seen yet. We entered a large chamber that was stacked to the brink with computers. There were huge touchscreens on both walls and at least a dozen engineers manning the technology. This is what I like to call the war room, Dr. Havard said. In here we gather all information we can on the necrotic church and their activities. Now, about today's news, we have reason to believe that they did not only confiscate the statues, but exterminated the whole species that crafted them as well. He spoke. What? Who knows what we could have found out by studying those animals? These thoughts will not let me sleep. What could the church be planning? 10 September 2322 AD. The workload over the last few weeks has been enormous, and I have not had much time to write down my thoughts. These are turbulent times, but I will get to that later. Now, since I am one of the scientists at the facility without extensive prior knowledge of astronomy, Dr. Havard had me doing mostly paperwork. I had to check the planets that had already been discarded by the other researchers to make sure that they were nothing special, check reports on the church in the war room, and listen to the incoming radio signals, or rather radio static from outer space. Most of it was not that exciting, but it left me plenty of time to talk with the other scientists there and focus on my own research. To be fair, it was not so bad at first, but then the church began tracking us down. To make matters worse, we could all follow it in the war room. We could see how the bastards were systematically hunting us all down, forcing us to slow our research down and keep a low profile. I have to admit that I was and still am frightened. The facility itself is pretty secure, but the risk of getting caught in your own home grows day by day. It feels as if we are running out of time. With so many of my colleagues being captured, my workload increased immensely, and I even got to help with the telescopes. It was then that I was finally initiated in the true progress that the facility had already made. Something, out there in the galaxy, was moving, and we had no clue what it was. The only proof we had of its existence were our calculations seeing the light had not even reached its part of the galaxy yet. But whatever it was, it had our whole facility confounded, as it did not seem to follow any of the laws centuries of scientific progress had come up with. 1. Our object does not move in a logical pattern and appears to be unaffected by gravity. 2. Our object seemingly pulls and releases other celestials in its vicinity at will, without any kind of foreseeable pattern. 11th September, 2322 AD. Those are not even the most disturbing things about whatever we found out there. I was not even supposed to be clued in about what follows, so perhaps I should not write about it either. But I do not feel like I have a choice anymore. This is too much. Here is my attempt at transcribing my conversation with Dr. Havard, as he had called me into his office today. "Dr. Rolston, have a seat." "Tea?" he greeted me. "Well, I do not mean to be blunt, but why did you call me in here?" "There is just so much work." "Ah, yes." "You picked up on any signals yet?" He answered blankly. "Well," I began until my eyes met his. "Fear?" "There is a reason I called you in here, Stephen. Our numbers are dwindling, and seeing as how you've helped greatly over the last few weeks, you deserve to know." He sighed and handed me a file. It was about the galactic anomaly we had discovered. The calculations show that our object's gravitational pull is so strong, so very powerful, that it is affecting the orbit of this very planet, as well as every other one. Dr. Havard resumed. "What? But we are dealing with something far beyond what we'd thought was rationally possible," he continued. "Beyond what we—" Dr. Havard fell silent for a moment and then looked up and started whispering something of which I could only decipher the word life or alive. I was frightened already. It felt as if I just stood there for hours, not knowing what to do. The man simply stared at the ceiling with that creepy blank stare. I had finally managed to open my mouth as he looked at me again. "We found God," he whispered. "We did." Isn't that a bit rash?" I answered, shivers running down my spine. "No, we did." His eyes were full of steely conviction. "And he knows. It's all in the file, how the light has stopped moving towards it ever since we discovered him. We still can't see further into that sector of space than we could 4 months ago." "That can't be right." "It is, but there's more." He grabbed the file out of my hands and began flipping through the pages. "Here, at exactly 10:06 a.m. yesterday, his movements ceased being random." His eyes grew wide. "But he is coming. Our Lord's on his way, and we are not prepared. I must remain calm and focused. I must be calm and focused. I am calm and focused. I am so. Am I?" 12th September 2322 AD. As was to be expected, I barely slept tonight. In the morning, I could not get up, though, and it was not until noon that I finally admit that I would not find the answers in my own home. So many questions kept rushing through my mind as I checked my email during breakfast. Surprisingly, Gerald had sent me a document overnight without any further information. A Dead God. Part 1. My name is Dr. Stephen Rolston, researcher at the Martian University of Creven. What follows aren't really research notes as much as they are a way of keeping me sane. I need them to truly grasp the magnitude of our discoveries, to keep the order in my mind, if you will. For as long as historians could remember, humanity had been looking for their God, but to no avail. Despite several millennium of searching, no deity was ever found. This never became a real issue, though, until the late 22nd century, when we invented the ships needed to explore space outside of our own solar system, the telescopes required to truly peek far into the universe and technology, allowing us to drill deep into the earth. Humanity had turned their eyes to the skies and to the planetary depths to look for answers. Neither heaven nor hell was ever found, however. Throughout the 23rd century, the disappointment grew, and a new church rose. Their priests preached about a dead God, believing that ours had somehow died. The religion had its major breakthrough in 2267, and by 2300, they had already converted over a third of the people to this new belief. The necrotic church had more power than it could ever need and grew stronger every year. My story begins a good 20 years later, however, with me waking up for another day of research. I aim to find a definitive answer to the age-old question, where is God? I refuse to believe he died. 24th August, 2322 AD. I decided to visit the observatory today. My research had been stale these past few weeks, and I felt I could use some new insights. There is only so much one can learn from the history books after all. It always strikes me as odd, though, whenever I talk to the scientists there, how we still have not discovered intelligent life. This in spite of our technological prowess and our planet-colonizing habits. I feel it would be a solace, though. I guess I just do not want to be alone. Probably goes for all of us. To be honest, I would already settle for a few ruins, some scriptures perhaps, anything but the animalistic species that dominate every habitable planet we come across. I digress. There actually was an exciting new discovery made which my colleagues there told me about. They had discovered a new species of gaver-like creatures, albeit with much more flexibility in their claw-like fingers, deep in the bush forests of Titan Major. Apparently the beasts had exhibited an irrational fear of the explorers, but that was not the strange part. Although the creatures, Vedans Titan Arashiro, displayed no exceptional cognitive abilities, they had somehow crafted numerous human-like statues out of the thin wood found there. The statues vary greatly in size, from a few inches to close to 10 feet, but apart from gender differences, they are almost exactly the same. I do not know what to make of it. Adam and Eve? Eden? I need some sleep. 27th August, 2322 AD. I received a message from Gerald as I woke up today. He urged to call me back right away. Apparently he had been trying to reach my cell all night. After all those years, he still did not remember that I could not sleep with that thing turned on. Not that it mattered much these past few nights. My research will not let me sleep, and even if I do fall asleep, I have to face the nightmares. I will not be writing those down here, however, as it is best if I just forget them. But I digress. Eager to catch up, I called Gerald during breakfast. I did not think too much of his calls during the night back then, for he had done so before. "Good morning, Dr. Starr. I hope you slept well," I began. "What? Are you alone?" He promptly interrupted me. "Yes? Yes, I am." "Good. Well, Dr. Rulston, I have some good news for you," he said, sounding like his old self again. "If they have not brainwashed you yet, of course." "They do try," I laughed. "What news do you have?" "You should come back to Earth, Stephen. At least that church does not control everything here yet." He explained to me how there was a whole community of like-minded scientists in Tokyo, some of them atheists. Gerald gave me a contact number of one of the Martian members. From what I understood, the scientists were split into two research groups. One branch aimed to find heaven or any sign of God in the galaxy. The other held on to the belief that God lived inside all of us. It is a shame I know Gerald to be a firm believer of the latter, for it would be a pleasure to work together again. Searching the galaxy sounds like a much more exciting prospect, however. 30 August, 2322 AD. Church confiscates alien artifacts, read the heading on the news website today. Can you believe that those priests actually did that? The first alien craftsmanship we ever found, and they are claiming it and probably burning it soon too. No scientist will be examining those wooden statues. On a more cheerful note, I finally met the other scientist Gerald had told me about. The Martian chapter operated in a state-of-the-art research facility on the crater plains near Cravan. I was able to explore the entirety of it with chief researcher Dr. Havard as my guide. He explained to me how they had found several rich benefactors, mainly older religions, to take care of the financial aspect of their research. Most of the funding was used on the observatory, however, and it was magnificent. The telescopes there were unlike any I had ever seen before, both in scale and effectivity. Furthermore, Dr. Havard assured me that those were not even the most advanced models they had. In the hallway stood a number of brand new telescopes still wrapped up in their packaging, and several parts of a legitimately giant one laid scattered across the floor. I also took the opportunity to ask him about the news I heard today, though I now wish I had not. "You heard the news today?" I asked. "About the church's latest confiscation." "Yes, I did," he nodded, "and I'm afraid there is even more to it than that. Come, walk with me." He led me through a series of highly secured doors into another wing of the research center that I had not seen yet. We entered a large chamber that was stacked to the brink with computers. There were huge touchscreens on both walls and at least a dozen engineers manning the technology. "This is what I like to call the war room," Dr. Havard said. "In here we gather all information we can on the necrotic church and their activities. Now, about today's news, we have reason to believe that they did not only confiscate the statues, but exterminated the whole species that crafted them as well." He spoke. "What? Who knows what we could have found out by studying those animals? These thoughts will not let me sleep. What could the church be planning?" 10 September, 2322 AD. The workload over the last few weeks has been enormous, and I have not had much time to write down my thoughts. These are turbulent times, but I will get to that later. Now, since I am one of the scientists at the facility without extensive prior knowledge of astronomy, Dr. Havard had me doing mostly paperwork. I had to check the planets that had already been discarded by the other researchers to make sure that they were nothing special, check reports on the church in the war room, and listen to the incoming radio signals, or rather radio static from outer space. Most of it was not that exciting, but it left me plenty of time to talk with the other scientists there and focus on my own research. To be fair, it was not so bad at first, but then the church began tracking us down. To make matters worse, we could all follow it in the war room. We could see how the bastards were systematically hunting us all down, forcing us to slow our research down and keep a low profile. I have to admit that I was and still am frightened. The facility itself is pretty secure, but the risk of getting caught in your own home grows day by day. It feels as if we are running out of time. With so many of my colleagues being captured, my workload increased immensely, and I even got to help with the telescopes. It was then that I was finally initiated in the true progress that the facility had already made. Something, out there in the galaxy, was moving, and we had no clue what it was. The only proof we had of its existence were our calculations seeing the light had not even reached its part of the galaxy yet. But whatever it was, it had our whole facility confounded, as it did not seem to follow any of the laws centuries of scientific progress had come up with. 1. Our object does not move in a logical pattern and appears to be unaffected by gravity. 2. Our object seemingly pulls and releases other celestials in its vicinity at will, without any kind of foreseeable pattern. 11th September, 2322 AD. Those are not even the most disturbing things about whatever we found out there. I was not even supposed to be clued in about what follows, so perhaps I should not write about it either, but I do not feel like I have a choice anymore. This is too much. Here is my attempt at transcribing my conversation with Dr. Havard as he had called me into his office today. "Dr. Rolston, have a seat." "Tea?" he greeted me. "Well, I do not mean to be blunt, but why did you call me in here?" "There is just so much work. True scary story about Las Vegas that no one tell you."
I was 23 years old when this happened. I'm 27 now, and there hasn't been a week that has gone by that I haven't thought about this trip. To celebrate our friend Andrew's 21st birthday, we were taking him on a trip to Vegas. He was always a laid-back and kind of shy dude, and we all knew that he hadn't yet done the deed. So, we planned on getting him really drunk and, to put it bluntly, getting him laid. We checked into the Carriage House Hotel, which was one of the more affordable hotels that we could find. We had 2 separate rooms, as there were 7 of us in total. There were 4 of us in the room that I was in, and Andrew was in the room with us. The first thing we did was eat, of course, as we were all starving. We then hit the casinos just to say that we did it. Out of the 7 of us, only 1 left with more money than they had entered with. We checked out a bunch of different bars, and as the night went on, things got more blurry, and everything got funnier. We got into a nightclub that was going wild. We caught 2 of our friends, John and Eddie, walking out with girls. They shot us the about to get lucky look, and we understood. The rest of us were trying to pressure Andrew into approaching a girl, but even in his drunken, somewhat loosened up state, he was still too shy to approach anybody or even dance. We got to the point where we were desperate to find somebody for Andrew. We could already foresee that he wouldn't meet any girls at this rate during the whole trip. We left the club in search of a working girl. You may think our actions were weird, but like most people at that time, we were completely hammered. We approached a girl walking alone, acting like a couple of idiots, and asked her if she would be interested in hanging out with our friend Andrew, who was very noticeably not quite as messed up as us, but still intoxicated nonetheless. The girl wasn't anything special, I could say that even in the state I was in, but we wanted Andrew to have a good time. I don't quite remember what she said in direct response to me, but I remember her voice being slightly deep to the point that I looked at my friend. I also have a slight memory of her analyzing Andrew from head to toe. Again, I don't remember what she said, but it led to her grabbing Andrew's arm and the 2 of them walking off down the sidewalk. We laughed as we could see how awkward Andrew already felt. None of us thought it was weird, though. But just out of curiosity to see what was going to go down, we decided to trail behind them. They didn't seem to exchange any words. In fact, it appeared as if the girl was pulling him. We followed for about 15 minutes. I would guess it could have been much longer, but I wouldn't really know. It was a darker and quieter street. The 2 of them stepped into what we assumed was an apartment building, and we all left. We were so proud and happy for him too. There was no point in us waiting there, so we went back to the club. At around 2 in the morning, we headed back to the hotel. Andrew wasn't in either of the rooms. I was starting to sober up a little, and a bit of concern began to arise in me. John and Eddie, who weren't with us earlier, were shocked to hear about what happened. We all kind of assumed Andrew was just spending the night with the girl. Still, it was out of character for Andrew to do anything like this, so it was just weird. I texted him and tried calling him. He never answered. My friends told me to relax, and I crashed minutes later. I woke to a ringing sound. At first, with my mind still in sleep mode, I assumed it was an alarm clock and tried tapping at my phone to turn it off. As my head began to return to reality, I realized the phone was ringing. It was Andrew's number. I literally felt my heart drop for whatever reason. I told my friends, who were already awake from the ringing. I answered and was greeted with heavy breathing on the other end. It was Andrew, and he sounded as if he were having some kind of panic attack. I put him on speakerphone so everyone could hear. Andrew began whispering into the phone. Most of it was incomprehensible, but we made out some of what he said. We heard him whisper, "It was that woman. Guys, you gotta get over here right now." We tried to engage him, but he wasn't answering anything we were saying. The other end went silent. We were all basically screaming into the phone, asking if he was all right, where he was, and what was going on. I was already shaking in my skin at that point. What happened next only made it 10 times worse. Something broke the silence on the other end, the sound of a door being opened with force, followed by the shrill and horrific screaming of Andrew. Then the call abruptly ended. We were all freaking out. I called the police and tried to remember the address or at least the street. We were so messed up the night before that I couldn't even remember the route we had taken. One of my friends claimed he did, though. The police came over to the hotel and escorted us. My friend seemed to remember exactly where the building was. He guided the police past the club, down the side roads, and eventually to the building. 2 officers from the front car went inside while we were told to wait by the other car. A few minutes felt like hours as we waited in anticipation and fear of the worst. Finally, one of the officers stepped out. She came over to us and asked if we could come inside to confirm if the dead body belonged to Andrew. I felt like the entire world just collapsed on my head. John and Jerry both started crying. They didn't want to go in. So, I followed the officer into the building. It turned out the place wasn't an apartment at all, but rather some kind of dark, abandoned storage building. Inside, there was a dead body leaning out from an open closet. The face was emotionless, the mouth lifelessly hung open, staring up at the ceiling. It was horrible, but it wasn't Andrew. I knew it right away. The most noticeable feature was the boy's blonde hair, while Andrew had black hair. The officers had already scoped the whole place out, but they didn't know what to do. I took a look in the closet, hoping Andrew might be hiding there. Nothing. Not even a cell phone. We all did our best to forget about it. But a little more than a month later, I got a phone call in the middle of the night once again. I picked up. There was bad reception, and nobody was saying anything. I was about to hang up when a faint, yet familiar voice said, "Jesse." "Andrew." I yelled. The sound of a door slamming in the background on the other end was the last thing I heard before the call ended. He didn't pick up after the 5 times I tried calling him back. So what did I do? I called the police and had them trace the call. The call wasn't coming from Nevada at all. No, it was coming from New Jersey, in fact, our own town, and from a house not too far away. The police said they were sending somebody to the house, but that wasn't enough for me. I had to go there myself. I GPS'd the address, hopped in my car, and floored it the whole 5 minutes it took to get there. It was a vacant house on a corner. I sneaked up to the front door and put my ear against it, listening for anything inside. Nothing. I crawled around to the back, where I found an open window. I listened for a moment and heard the faint sounds of small snaps and cracks coming from upstairs, the kind of sounds you hear from someone standing or moving on wood. I was sure he was in there. I hopped inside, but I didn't even get to begin my search before noticing something at the edge of the hallway. Someone was standing there, facing me, but I couldn't see their face. All I could see were their pale, exposed legs and long black hair hanging down past their shoulders. It was a woman. I felt sick to my stomach, anticipating her charging at me like in some kind of horror movie. But instead, she turned and ran in the opposite direction. I heard the sound of a door slamming shut, followed by footsteps stomping downstairs. Then, yelling from a man and a woman. There was an even heavier pair of footsteps now stomping up the stairs. That was my cue to run. I left the house and dove into the bushes. Not even 5 seconds later, someone stepped out onto the porch. For the first time in months, it seemed as if luck was finally on my side. A police car pulled up to the curb, its siren flashing. I heard the guy on the stoop mutter something before slamming the door behind himself. The police followed him inside. Apparently, the idiot didn't even lock the door. I stayed hidden because I didn't want to startle the cops and end up with a bullet in my skull. I waited by the car out front. Minutes later, one of the officers came outside with the guy in cuffs. I introduced myself and warned them that there was also a woman in the house. But they never found the woman. In fact, one of the bedroom windows was completely open, which implied that she had escaped. Andrew was found upstairs, locked in a closet. He was in horrible shape, malnourished, his hair long and dirty. You could smell him from a mile away. The police ran the records for the man. He was never married, so they had no way of finding out who the woman was. He even claimed that he had only known her for a day. Nothing made sense, and it still doesn't. Andrew admitted that he was raped, beaten, and hardly fed. I can't even imagine admitting something like that to someone. The girl who originally escorted him to that building was only there to collect payment from what Andrew described as the operators. For some reason, they forced Andrew to give them his hometown and the addresses of everyone who was with him that night. This explained why they were in our town, but not why they were in our town. What were their intentions? To kill us? To add us to whatever kind of sex slave operation they were running? I'm the only person Andrew has told out of our group of friends. Whenever somebody asked about it, I just said I didn't know what happened. Things were finally starting to look up, until a few days later. I got a text message from a random number late one night saying, Whoever it was blocked me immediately, so I couldn't respond. I just blocked him back. It happened again the next week. And then the next month. Sure, I had the idea that it had something to do with the incident, but I had no idea it would be taken as far as it was. One night, I woke up to a hint of brightness in my room. There was light outside in the backyard, shining ever so slightly through the closed blinds. It wasn't sunlight. It was the backyard porch light. I could see a shadow moving in front of the blinds. Somebody was definitely out there. I couldn't see much through the crack at the bottom of the blind, so I inched it up ever so slightly. There was somebody standing by the window, looking right at me, as if they were waiting for me. But they were gone before I could even think about grabbing my phone to get a picture of them. I strongly believe it was that woman I saw in the house. That was the last time I saw or heard from anyone involved in this. Nothing about this whole situation has made a single ounce of sense, even with the best explanation Andrew could give me. I don't see a point in getting into how Andrew and everyone else is doing. It's nothing interesting. The only thing I can say is this: I'm waiting. Waiting for the next time I see any of these animals. When that happens, I'll be ready to call the police, or take them on myself. The deep web is one of the most amazing things on earth. Not because of how joyful it makes people or anything, but because it is a completely uncensored view of people. You can speak your mind, buy what you want, do anything you want. When on the deep web, you have complete and total freedom. I had always been fascinated by the deep web, and at the time the events in this story occurred, I was in college. Lots of people at my campus had really been getting into accessing the deep web. It was almost like a trend. With so many people getting on it, it seemed perfectly safe for me to give it a try. Now I had always heard of the deep web horror stories of hacking, stumbling on disgusting sites, and people even somehow finding your address. These stories were mainly what kept me off the deep web, but with most of the people at my college using it on a normal basis, I decided to give it a go. I asked a friend to come over and help me set it up. When my friend arrived, we opened up my laptop and began to set everything up. He told me that we were using Tor, a program that lets you access the deep web. He also asked me if I was planning on doing anything illegal, to which I replied no. He said that since I wasn't, we didn't need to install Tails, which is apparently a software that makes it more secure if you plan on doing illegal things. A little while later, everything was set up. I had my new IP address, and my friend gave me a brief rundown of what to do and what not to do. He made it very clear that when I was using the hidden wiki, that I kept it on censored mode, so that it would be less likely for me to see something I didn't want to see. After about 2 weeks of using the deep web, I felt like a pro. I had accessed many different sites, spoken with some great people, made friends, even bought some weed. I had become cocky and was ready to dig deeper into the dark web. I turned off the censored mode on the hidden wiki and began to browse the links. It took a while, mostly because Tor is a bit slow and many of the links just led to dead web pages. Eventually, I stumbled onto a site called All the Gore. It was mainly a big chat room with many different topics. I had a fairly strong stomach. I had seen many violent movies and had seen beheadings, killings, etc. through the normal internet. After looking at a few different chat rooms, I noticed how sick this site really was. The people in these chat rooms were actually killers, bragging about some of the things they had done. In the chat room, you could also post pictures. One man by the name of Culture045 had the stage in one of the chat rooms. He was explaining in detail how he had broke into someone's house, kidnapped a little girl, and brutally killed her parents by hiding under their bed, and then opening their throats. He then explained how he brought the little girl back to his house, raped her, beat her, and cut her up. I didn't think he was telling the truth at first, but then he posted pictures. These were the most horrifying pictures I had ever seen. Close-ups of the poor 8 to 10-year-old girl, being brutally raped, beaten, and cut with a knife. Culture kept posting pictures. The new ones were of the girl, tied to a chair, bleeding, crying, throwing up, etc. Then, he showed a picture of him with a drill, drilling into her skull. The most haunting part is that while he was doing it, he was looking at the camera with sheer joy on his face. I had seen enough and typed in the chat room window, "You people are sick and deserve to die. How can you sleep at night?" Immediately people began making fun of me, saying that I was just as helpless and ignorant as the little girl in the pictures, and that I should get off the big boy part of the internet. They began saying I was a pussy and calling me an empath. When Culture typed something in the chat box, he said, "Really? Where do you live, buddy? I'm sure everybody would love to see you on this site." I then make the biggest mistake of my life and typed, "I'm calling the police and having this site shut down." Less than a minute later, everything on the site went black and a new chat box appeared in green. In it, someone named Admin1 typed in the box. He said, "Call the cops and you will regret it." I didn't type anything in the box and reached for my cell phone. What happened next haunts me to this day. My phone said I had a new message. I opened it, and it said, "Call the police, and you're dead." There was no number. It didn't even say unknown number, it was just blank. I looked back at my laptop and saw my webcam light turn on. I quickly covered it, but I saw on the screen a picture of me looking at my phone. I got wide-eyed and froze for a moment when the admin typed again, "Put the phone down right now and uncover your webcam." I put my phone down, but kept the webcam covered. When he typed again, "Okay then, be like that." Right after, he posted my full name, age, and address in the chat box and typed, "It would be a shame if you and your college buddies went missing, wouldn't it?" He said. I then did as he said and uncovered my webcam. He then told me to follow his instructions on how to make it impossible for me to reach the site again. I followed each and every one. When I finished, I got a text that said, "Now don't ever try and come back." Just like before, it had no number. I still called the police from my friend's phone, but they were never able to find the site. If you ever go on the deep web, don't ever just mindlessly explore, especially if you don't have additional software to keep you more secure. I was a stupid college kid, and I just hope nobody makes the same mistakes I did. I moved to a different home and changed all of my information, but I still get nightmares to this day. I was extremely rattled by what had happened. The police tried to track down the website, but since there was no way for them to recover my history, and I had originally found the sick site by just randomly clicking links, it seemed pretty hopeless to find it. The police told me to change all my information about myself and to move in with a friend. After changing pretty much all of my information, I decided to move in with my friend David. David was an extremely honest, hardworking person. He never went to parties, slacked off, got drunk/high. He was very dedicated to finishing college. In fact, he was one of the few kids I knew at the time who wasn't getting on the deep web regularly. I had told him all about my experience with the deep web, and that's mostly why he agreed to let me stay with him. One night, we were both up studying very late when my phone went off. I looked to see who had texted me and saw that the person sending the message had no number, just like last time. It read, "Check your computer." There was nothing else to it, just one simple instruction. I opened my laptop, and when I did, I noticed that I didn't have control of the mouse. I tried to move it, but the mouse had just moved on its own. Someone had remote access to my computer somehow. I never gave anyone remote access before. I tried a whole bunch of keyboard commands, but not a single one worked. I noticed that whoever had control of my laptop was downloading a software, most likely malware, but there was nothing I could do. I heard my phone go off again, and this time, the message said, "Look out your window." I was sitting right by a window. I didn't know which window the guy was referring to, so I looked out the one I was sitting by and saw a man in the parking lot leaning up against a white van. He had a phone in his hand, and when I looked at him, he nodded. My phone went off again. Type in and hold down Alt F5 at the same time to activate the software. I called in David to my room to show him what was going on. He seemed just as nervous as I was, but with the man just outside our window, we didn't want to anger him. David called the police right away and told me that they would be there soon. I didn't activate the software and just sat there. Eventually I got another text. "I am coming in if you don't do it right now." I didn't know why he or the person in control of my computer couldn't do it, but I didn't dare to ask. At the same time though, I was 99% sure this program had malware or spyware, or something that would be very harmful to my computer, so I refused to activate it. David grabbed a baseball bat, just in case the man outside tried to come in. About 5 minutes later, we heard the door knob turning. It was locked, but we then heard banging at the door. We both freaked out and I looked out the window again. Sure enough, the man and the van were gone. The banging on the door got more and more violent, until eventually, we heard a horrible scratching sound. It lasted a few more minutes, and then we heard footsteps walk down the hall and eventually fade away. I received another text. "We will be back." That really got to me. When the cops arrived, they told me to look at my door. I followed them back out into the hallway and saw engraved in our door, my name. The police began investigating the whole building, and they had a tech police officer come in and look at my computer. He began to do scans and investigate the weird software on my laptop. Eventually, he managed to close and remove it, and told me that my laptop isn't safe. He said the core files of it have been hacked into /corrupted. We did a complete wipe of my laptop, and he looked at my phone as well. Just like last time, he couldn't tell where the messages came from, and told me that they would be sure to keep some cops nearby in case this ever happened again. The next day, I had just got home from school and was really tired. David wasn't home yet, so I went into my room and fell into the bed. I had just begun to close my eyes when I heard a rattling sound in my closet. I lifted my head up and didn't hear it again, so I went back to sleep. After a few minutes, the closet door swung open. I leaped out of bed and saw a man with a mask walking over to me. I ran for the door and slammed it behind me. I ran out to the parking lot, started my car, and drove away as fast as I could. By the time the police arrived, the man was of course gone. The apartment surprisingly had not been wrecked or anything. We didn't even find anything stolen. He didn't seem to do anything at first. This night, 2 police officers were monitoring everyone who came in / out of the building in order to catch the man. I opened my laptop and noticed that my wallpaper had changed. It was just a bunch of trees, but it had been changed to a sickening photo of a man with a mask, the same mask that I saw on the man who was in my closet, digging a knife into a baby's eye in what looked like a small cabin. I also noticed that all my applications and programs were gone, and I saw the same software as last time. Right in the middle, I clicked on it, and it had already been installed. Just like last time, it filled the entire screen, and what looked like a live stream was going on. I couldn't exit out, and the live stream was coming from a boy's house. He looked about 13 or 14 and was at his computer. It didn't take long for me to see that I was watching through his webcam, and he had no idea. I saw a small chat box pop up in the top right of the screen, and in it, someone typed in the box, "Welcome to our live stream. We are glad everyone could be here. Thank you, John, for being here as well." My eyes got very wide. My name was John, and they were waiting until I was watching to start the live stream. As I watched, I saw that the closet door behind the poor boy slowly opened, and a man walked out with a toolbox in one hand. He quietly set the toolbox down and pulled out some duct tape. He went behind the kid and put the tape over his mouth and grabbed him tight. The poor kid's face was of total fear. He tried to scream, but he couldn't because of the tape. They were making a decent amount of noise, so it told me that the kid must have been home alone. I tried hard to exit out, but I couldn't. I then saw the man take out a screwdriver and drive it into the kid's chest. Blood began to pour out, and the kid made an awful wheezing type noise. I saw tears come from his eyes as this sick man began to drive the screwdriver deeper and deeper, and then yank it out. The man then took out a hammer and smashed the kid's hands several times till they were nothing more than a mangled, bloody mess. I tried every command I could to exit out, but nothing was working. I noticed that in the chat box, several people were cheering the man on and requesting for him to do different things to the boy. The man then took out a handheld electric saw, pressed it against the boy's face, and turned it on. The boy screamed with pain as the saw went up into his eye, causing blood to go everywhere and get on the camera a little as well. I started to get tears in my eyes as I couldn't stop it. Then, the man took the screwdriver, gouged out the kid's eyes, and took out a large knife. He proceeded to slit the boy's throat and tossed him on the ground. I was sick. I threw up all over the floor, and when I looked back, I saw in the chat box people typing in horrible things like "fap fap fap" or, "Oh my God, that was so wonderful. Thanks so much for doing this, ECT." In the box, I saw someone named Culture045 type into the box, "Thanks for watching, John, winky face." After that, the program closed on its own, and I was left with the sickening wallpaper. I was sweating, breathing heavy, and feeling sick. Throughout the entire thing, I didn't realize that my phone had gone off several times. I looked at it, and the most hateful, mean messages were coming from my friends and family. I asked my mom what was wrong, and she texted back, "You sent that sick, disturbing live stream to everyone. I can't believe who you are. The police have been called." I felt even more sick than before. Those monsters had sent that live stream to all my friends somehow and made it come for me. They had pretty much ruined my life within a couple minuets. When the police arrived, I told them everything that had happened, and quickly they managed to explain to all my friends and family what had happened. They really cracked down on finding these people, and a month later, 4 men had been arrested. One was Culture045, the other was Admin1, and the 2 others were working with them. The site was found and shut down as well, and I got a new laptop and phone. I could say some horror cliche here and say something like I kept getting texts or kept hearing weird things ever since, but none of that happened. They were arrested, and I never heard anything further. It's good to know that those men are in jail or perhaps even dead, but what scares me is all the other people watching the live stream, who were there for pleasure, are still out there, and that there is probably thousands of other Culture045s out there all over the world.
5 true scary New Year's Eve stories to end 2024. Story number 1. This happened on New Year's Eve back in 2017. I'm from Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, and I was flying home after finishing up a semester at the University of Rochester. I had to stay at school a week after the semester ended for personal reasons, so I unfortunately spent Christmas relatively alone. The flight itself was fine, but I'd already been in a sour mood before I even boarded the plane. I'm a big Browns fan, and as I was at the airport, the Browns lost their final game of the regular season to go 0-16, completely winless. As a lifelong fan, it was a special kind of misery. I think we were the first team to go winless since the 80s or something. To top it off, my flight was delayed, which ruined my family's plans for the night. Originally, we were all supposed to drive to my cousin's house together for a New Year's Eve party and stay the night. But because of the delay, my parents decided to leave early, taking the main car. I was stuck driving the spare car alone. My mom tried to make it up to me by leaving Vera, our golden retriever, behind to keep me company. I wasn't thrilled about making the trip solo, but Vera was always good company. I figured I'd make the most of it. By the time my Uber dropped me off from the airport, it was creeping on 10 o'clock. I didn't even bother unpacking. I just jammed all my stuff in the car, got Vera, locked up the house, and got on the road. The drive itself wasn't anything special, just miles of Ohio, back roads winding through empty fields and patches of forest. There wasn't much snow on the ground, just a light dusting, which was nice since I hated driving in the snow. It was pitch black, though. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional farmhouse with its porch light glowing faintly in the distance. About halfway into the trip, Vera started whining. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but then she stood up, pacing in the passenger seat. That's when I realized she needed to go to the bathroom. I groaned, knowing there wasn't much else I could do but pull over. The next clearing I came across was small, barely enough space for the car, but it would have to do. I remember noting to myself how dark it really was out there. If not for the patches of white snow here and there, I probably wouldn't have been able to see into the woods at all. I jammed my hands in my pockets and tried my best not to freeze to death. Vera didn't seem to care about the cold or the darkness. Classic golden retriever. I let her out, not even bothering to leash her. She sniffed around the edge of the trees, taking her sweet time. She didn't wander far, just enough to do her business. That's when I heard it. All of a sudden, a loud crashing sound echoed from somewhere in the woods. It wasn't just a branch breaking. It was heavier and deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the trees. I literally jumped from how loud it was. Imagine a grown man sprinting through the forest. That's genuinely what it sounded like. I scanned the darkness, squinting to make out anything, but it was too dark to see beyond the first few trees. Before I could react, Vera bolted directly into the woods. It was some worst nightmare type stuff, I'm telling you. She disappeared into the trees, and I lost sight of her in mere seconds. I yelled her name over and over, but she didn't come back. At that point, my heart was racing, and it started getting hard to breathe. The cold didn't help matters. I couldn't leave her out there. That wasn't an option. Without thinking, I ran into the woods blindly, yelling for her to come back. I didn't want to think about what she was chasing after, so I just ran, letting the adrenaline take over. The only light to aid me was my dim phone flashlight and the thin layer of snow on the ground. It was so dark I was practically running into the trees. I kept running, praying I'd find her before she caught up to whatever was in there. I ran until my lungs gave out from the cold, forcing me to take a break. After nearly falling over from exhaustion, I leaned up against a tree and felt myself about to break down. I honestly didn't know what to do. And then, finally, I saw her. She was crouched low and shivering, walking slowly toward me. Her tail was tucked tightly between her legs. I had never seen her like that before. I dropped to my knees and embraced her. Relief flooded through me. She pressed against me, and I could feel her body trembling. Something had terrified her. That's when I snapped back to reality and realized how serious the situation was. We were still in the middle of the woods, and there was still something out there. I sprung up from my position and told Vera to follow me. This time, she obeyed and stuck by my side like her life depended on it. We started back to the car, but I had no idea if I was going the right way. As if things weren't bad enough, I damn near jumped out of my skin when I heard crashing from behind me. I didn't think. I just started running. Vera darted ahead of me, and I followed her, praying I didn't trip. The crashing sound didn't stop this time. It seemed like it was following us. I can't even tell you how scared I was in that moment. I genuinely felt like I was going to die. By some miracle, Vera led me straight back to the car, and I practically threw her inside before slamming the door shut. As I was jumping into the driver's seat, I glanced back toward the woods, and my stomach dropped. There were 3 figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I jammed the keys in the ignition and floored it out of there. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I was still in shock. It wasn't until I had driven a few miles that I noticed Vera was bleeding. I started panicking as I realized there was a cut just below her shoulder blade. Someone had stabbed her. I slammed on the brakes and ran around to the trunk. My mom always kept a first aid kit in every car. And for once, her insistence on being overly prepared paid off. I cleaned Vera's cut as best I could and wrapped it in gauze. She whimpered, and I worried that I was hurting her, but I knew I was doing the right thing. For the first time since the whole sequence had started, I felt myself begin to relax. It was over. I tried not to think about it for the rest of the drive, but I was just so shell-shocked that something like that had happened to me. I ended up not telling my parents or relatives. I don't know why. It just felt like one of those things you keep to yourself. Story number 2. What I'm about to tell you is something I still think about often, especially during this time of year. This happened on New Year's Eve a few years ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the New Year with them. They live a few hours away in upstate Pennsylvania, so I'd left in the late afternoon, figuring I'd get there with plenty of time to spare. The drive was supposed to be simple. I'm the type who really enjoys long drives, so a nice, peaceful drive would give me some much-needed time to think. But the weather had other plans. The snow started falling about an hour into my drive. At first, it was light, just flurries dusting the windshield. Nothing to worry about, I thought. The snowfall was actually quite pretty. But I'm pretty sure I jinxed myself. The farther I drove, the harder the snow came down. It just kept falling and falling until I was literally in the middle of an honest-to-God blizzard. The highway turned slick, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My car, a little sedan, isn't exactly great in snow, so when the tires started slipping on even the smallest hills, I knew I had to pull over. There was no point in risking my life. It was my own fault for not planning out the drive better. I found a spot on the shoulder, far enough off the road to avoid passing cars. Not that there were many. I texted my parents about my situation, and they seemed worried sick. I tried to reassure them that everything would be okay, but I honestly wasn't too sure about that myself. I figured I'd wait out the worst of the storm, hoping it would just ease up. But the snow didn't let up. In fact, it only seemed to get worse from that point. It just kept coming, piling up around the car and on the road ahead. After an hour or so, it became clear I wasn't going anywhere that night. My dad offered to try and get out to me, but I told him that that was a death wish. I told them that if the snow didn't let up, I'd call the police, which he begrudgingly accepted as a decent solution. I really didn't want to call the police, and I didn't have either, so that wasn't an option. I told myself the storm would have to let up eventually, and I decided that if it didn't by the time I got tired, I'd call the police. The thought of spending the night in the car made me uneasy. I didn't want to run out of gas trying to keep warm, and I was worried about killing the battery if I kept the lights or heat on too long. I sat there, turning the engine on and off every so often, trying to conserve what I could. The wind howled outside. I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation when I looked at my rearview mirror and saw headlights cutting through the storm from behind me. I literally wanted to jump for joy. A snowplow pulled up beside me. I was saved. I rolled down the window as the driver leaned out of his. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 50s. He looked nice. He was wearing a thick jacket and had a black knit hat that was pulled down over his ears. I remember thinking his face was really wrinkly, if that makes sense. It looked weathered, like he had spent decades in harsh conditions. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for what seemed like an unusual amount of time. Eventually he spoke, asking me if I was okay. He had a really gruff voice, definitely a smoker, and it was honestly kind of off-putting. I told him that I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, trying to be friendly, but also keep my voice steady. He nodded, saying that I wouldn't get far in a storm like this, especially with the car I had. He paused for a few moments, as if he were considering what to say. I watched his eyes scan my back seat, like he was looking for something. I was just about to respond when he offered to give me a ride. I hesitated. I didn't know him. And, yeah, he seemed a little strange. But he struck me as a genuine guy. Plus, staying put with my car all night would have been stupid. I asked him if he could drive me to where I was going, and he said it would be no problem. I then asked him what I should do about my car, to which he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Leave it." After a moment, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. At first, the warmth was comforting. I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease as I settled into the seat. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him about my parents' house. I gave him directions, and he nodded again, but didn't say much after that. The silence wasn't awkward, but as the minutes passed, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. That's when I noticed something odd. He wasn't driving in the direction of my parents' house, I knew because the navigation was literally pointing in the opposite direction. I mean, we were on a local highway. There were only two ways to go. I tried my best to sound calm and asked him if we were going the right way in the most normal tone I could muster. I don't think I did a good job, though, because I could feel his demeanor slightly change with my question. Without looking at me, he told me we were taking a short detour and that the back roads would be better than the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. We drove a little longer, and he did, in fact, get off the highway and start driving along some back road. At least the GPS said we were heading in the right direction, so I thought I was just being paranoid. Something in my gut was still telling me he was off, though, so I started looking around the cab more closely. There were red flags everywhere. Empty liquor bottles rolled on the floor near his feet. There were torn-up maps stuffed into the side pockets, and I caught a glimpse of a knife wedged between the seats. I felt my heart start pounding. You know that feeling where your heart just starts beating like crazy, and you're worried other people can hear it? That's what was happening to me. By that time, I was also positive we weren't going the right way. The GPS kept recalibrating because he missed turn after turn, not even looking at it. I was panicking. As we continued driving, I spotted a house in the distance. It was the only one I'd seen for miles. I had to act. It felt like a lifeline. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and then kicked the door open as hard as I could. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I slammed into the ground and felt my leg flare up with pain. I didn't care, though. I got to my feet and started running toward the house. The man shouted something at me, and I glanced back to see him fumbling for something in the glove box. Probably going for a gun, for all I knew. I didn't look back again. I sprinted through the snow, trying not to slip, until I reached the house. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. A man and woman opened it, and they basically pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. I told them what had just happened, and they didn't ask questions. They just called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They said they'd keep an eye out and search the area, but in that storm, finding him was unlikely. They offered to give me a ride to my parents' house and even help me call someone to tow my car. I was beyond grateful. My dad was furious once he found out, and I haven't driven in the snow since. I always think about what might have happened had I not jumped out of the car when I did.
Now to the next story. Story number 3.
I've never been one for parties. Even in college, I got sick of the whole going out culture pretty quickly. I found that I always had more fun doing something meaningful with a few close friends. I'm from a rural area in northwestern Ontario. This happened a couple of years ago. Ever since I was a kid, my dad and his buddies had a New Year's Eve tradition of going ice fishing. While everyone else was celebrating the new year however they celebrated, my mom wasn't really in the picture, and we didn't have much extended family. So I grew up spending New Year's Eve on a frozen lake in the frigid cold with my dad, his brother, my brother, and my dad's friends. My dad isn't around anymore, and my brother moved to Chicago a number of years ago, but I still try to go ice fishing as much as possible, especially as a way to celebrate New Year's Eve. I'm not really sure why. I just feel like I have some kind of obligation to keep the tradition going. My two best friends, Nate and Trevor, are pretty rugged guys themselves. You know the type. Those burly, lumberjack-looking dudes who seem more in touch with the wilderness than society. That's honestly how I'd describe myself too. Anyway, the three of us tried to keep the tradition alive as best we could, which was great because spending New Year's Eve alone would be depressing as hell. Nate was the one driving that day. His truck was perfect for the job, Big tires, four-wheel drive, and enough room in the back for all of our gear. We packed everything we needed: rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled to haul everything, and a small pop-up shelter to shield us from the worst of the cold. The forecast predicted a clear night. But in Ontario, you never trust the weather reports entirely. We were prepared for anything, or at least we thought we were. The lake we were heading to wasn't a well-known spot, and that's what we loved about it. It was tucked away, surrounded by thick trees, with a surface that stayed frozen solid even in the milder parts of winter. It wasn't a place you'd stumble across unless you knew exactly where to look. As Nate navigated the snowy back roads, the excitement started to build. There's something about the quiet stillness of ice fishing, just you, your friends, and the promise of the catch. It definitely beats drinking beer after beer at some random bar. As we pulled up to park near the trailhead, I noticed someone standing nearby. He was a few yards away, bundled up in heavy winter gear, but something about him didn't feel right. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at our truck. At first, I thought maybe he was just a fellow angler sizing us up, but then I saw him glance down at his phone, then back at us, then back at his phone again. For some reason, it didn't feel casual. I don't really know how to explain it. It just felt off. I muttered to my friends that the guy was creeping me out. The two of them looked up. Trevor shrugged his shoulders, and Nate nodded, but didn't say anything. We were about to start unloading when the man suddenly rushed toward us, waving his arms wildly. I rolled the window down to hear what he was saying. He started screaming that we needed to come help him immediately, and that his buddy had just fallen through the ice. He pointed at his phone, saying the other guy they were with had just told him. He sounded frantic, and his desperation was definitely real. Without even thinking, Trevor opened his door, and then we were all out, following the man as he took off down the trail toward the lake. We didn't stop to grab anything, not even our coats. The urgency in his voice was enough to override any second thoughts. The man was practically sprinting, and we had to jog to keep up. As we got closer to the lake, I started to notice something that didn't sit right. He wasn't leading us to the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading toward a more remote part of the shoreline, away from where the ice was thickest. I was about to stop following, but it was too late. They appeared in view before we could do anything. 2 more men standing near the edge of the lake. They weren't dressed for fishing and they weren't moving. They were just standing there waiting. I glanced down at their hands. They were both armed. My blood ran cold. One of them yelled at us to stop right there as we approached. He raised his gun and pointed it directly at me. I honestly can't describe the feeling you get when someone points a gun at you. I hope no one ever has to experience what I felt that day. My heart dropped as the man we'd been following turned to face us, a smirk creeping across his face. We'd been set up. The second guy demanded Nate's keys along with everything we had on our person. We didn't really have a choice. These guys didn't seem like they were messing around. Nate reached into his pocket and tossed the truck keys to the man, and the 3 of us emptied our pockets. I tried to hang on to my phone, but one of the men said, "Phones too." Nate said his was in the car, which they laughed about. I've never been more furious in my life. How could we have been so foolish? I clenched my fists, wishing those guys weren't armed. I would have taken all of them on. Within moments, they grabbed everything and walked us back up the path at gunpoint. Then, one of the men sped off in Nate's car, while the other 2 backed away into the woods, presumably to their own vehicle. I debated following them, but I figured that wouldn't be much help. We stood there for a moment, shivering, before Nate pulled out his phone. I knew he had lied about it being in the car. I honestly don't know what we would have done had he not thought quickly on his feet. Somehow, we still had service. He called the police, explaining everything as clearly as he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put, and we huddled together for warmth as we waited for help to arrive. I was still so unbelievably angry. Nate was the worst, though. He kept kicking nearby trees and cursing at the top of his lungs. There was nothing Trevor or I could do to calm him down. The whole thing had happened so fast, I was honestly still processing it all. Why the hell would there be people out in the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve of all days? It didn't make any sense. I'll skip all the boring details. The cops took an official report and were gracious enough to drive us all back to Trevor's house, which was the closest. As you might expect, Nate's car was never located, and those people were never caught. The three of us still can't believe what happened. Trevor thinks we just stumbled into the wrong people at the wrong time, that they weren't planning on robbing us, but we just so happened to be the perfect targets. I think that's possible, but it still feels so unlikely. Who just springs a trap on some random people in the spur of the moment? But it also wouldn't make sense for them to be waiting for us at such a secluded spot. They had no guarantee anyone would show up. I really have no idea what to make of this whole incident. Now to the next story. Story number 4. After moving to the dorms for college, I started drinking a lot more than I did in high school. It changed me. During winter break, I came back home to my parents' house to spend the holidays with my family. New Year's was just becoming a holiday that I looked forward to since it entailed a lot of partying with other people my age. It was New Year's Eve night. My parents were out at a friend's party. I had my 2 best friends over. I'll call them Jim and Steve. That was really our hometown squad back then. We didn't have that many other friends that liked to go out. I had them over to drink and hang out while we figured out our plans for the night. Jim, apparently, was talking to this girl who invited him to a party across town. She told him that we could come too, so that was our plan. We downed a few shots of rum, then polished off a few cans of beer each. We were all pretty drunk. Jim called an Uber to the address the girl gave him, and we all split it 3 ways. Jim said he never met this girl, but they matched on Tinder a week ago, and she was really pretty and seemed cool based on her texting style. The Uber driver pulled us up in front of some storage-looking building. This was apparently the address. We were confused. Jim read the address over, and we all confirmed on our phones that this building was what came up under the address. Before allowing the Uber driver to leave, Jim confirmed with the girl he was talking to that it was, in fact, this building, and not a house. Almost instantly, she texted back confirming this, so we all got out of the Uber. The car slowly disappeared down the street. We made jokes about not really wanting to go in and calling the Uber to come back, but ultimately we ended up just going in. We looked for an entryway, and it seemed there was a small door left open with a big guy standing by it. We approached him and asked if this was the party. He nodded his head and pointed into the doorway without saying a word. Pretty sketchy. We walked into this very dark, narrow hallway, following a lone ceiling light hanging at the end of the hall. We were getting closer to the sound of loud, rumbling music. At the end of the hall, we found the opening to what I guess was supposed to be the party floor. It wasn't nearly as big on the inside as the outside. It was very dark, the only lighting coming from a couple of cheap-looking strobe light machines. There wasn't a huge crowd, maybe 20 to 30 people sprawled out throughout the area. No one was really dancing. Everyone was kind of standing in their own little circles. A lot of people were just sitting in chairs by themselves, kind of eyeing us down. The weirdest and most off-putting thing of all, though, we didn't see any females. The music was very loud and hard to talk over, so we moved to a corner further from the speakers and the crowds. I yelled at Jim to call that girl and ask her where she was. She texted back, saying she was in the back section just beyond the double doors. She told us to meet her there. This didn't sound right, and I told Jim that. He said we'd just take a peek back there and leave if she wasn't there. Jim led the way, following the directions from this girl. We went through these 2 doors held open by door stoppers into a dimly lit, narrow hall with a bunch of doors. As we walked, someone quickly appeared from one of the rooms and whispered something in Jim's ear. Jim kept saying, "What?" looking very confused. Then he turned to us and waved his hand, saying, "Let's just get out of here." We didn't question it. As we walked back through that little main dance hall, I could tell we were getting looked at again. Some big guy at one of the doors tried stopping us for whatever reason. We just walked through him and back down the hall we came through. We noticed he was following us, and finally Jim yelled, "Run!" and started sprinting down the hall. That's when I knew stuff was real. We followed, and the guy behind us yelled at the top of his lungs, "Yo, stop them!" Probably to the guy standing at the entry door. He didn't really make an effort to stop us, though, when we ran back out the front door. We ran out of the little parking lot into the closest main road, where we called an Uber again. Jim explained that the dude in the hall whispered in his ear to get out of there before midnight, as they were going to trap everyone in there. Jim didn't ask any more questions. He basically just told us to haul ass out. This led us to believe that girl Jim was talking to didn't exist. It was just some kind of trap to lure unsuspecting victims into whatever was about to go down in that building that night. We made an anonymous police report that something was going down in there that night and that it should be investigated and shut down. We spent midnight on that New Year sitting in my living room by ourselves. We never found out what transpired in that warehouse. Now to the last story, story number 5. It was New Year's Eve of 2016. My girlfriend and I were hosting a party in my condo. I invited about 30 people and said they could bring whoever they wanted as long as they were respectful of my place. As we were setting things up for the party, we kept losing things, and then finding them back in the same place a few minutes later. Like the TV remote, her bag, or just anything we seemed to need at the moment. We thought we were just imagining it, but it kept happening over and over. We figured it was the 2 of us just accidentally moving stuff without the other knowing. Our guests started pouring in around 9 to 10, which was when we told everyone to arrive. Since my friends would be bringing friends, I positioned some of my surveillance cameras in rooms with valuables, such as the living room and the bedrooms. By the time everyone was over, things were still kind of disappearing. At one point, I wanted to show my friends my new pair of shoes that my girlfriend got me for Christmas, and I couldn't find them. Even stranger, my window was left open in my bedroom, albeit it was a party, and I had to assume my girlfriend or some of the guests had to do with some of this stuff. It started getting weird. Nevertheless, the condo was crowded, and I didn't have much time to be worrying about this stuff. I told myself I'd check the surveillance footage after the party, or, if things persisted, I'd check it during the party. There were a handful of faces I didn't recognize, but I met most of them through whichever friends brought them over. That time of the night, that people either can't wait for or dread, finally came, and we all started to gather around the TV to watch the ball drop in Times Square. I looked around the room and noticed some tall guy in a black trench coat facing the wall opposite the TV. He was looking down at the couch doing something. I was about to ask my friend Alan if he knew who that was, but everyone started counting down. So I turned my attention to that and joined in. Everyone yelled, "Happy New Year," and all that. Anyone who came as a couple got their New Year's kiss. When everyone settled down a bit, I realized that tall guy wasn't in the room anymore. I asked Alan if he knew who that tall guy was, and he said, "Yeah, that's Tom's friend." So that was that. One of my friend's girlfriends eventually came downstairs and said whoever the guy in the trench coat wasn't leaving the bathroom. I told her it was Tom's friend and to just use the master bedroom bathroom, So she went back upstairs. Eventually, the clock hit 2 a.m., and that's when things were dwindling down and people were starting to make their exits. When everyone was gone, my girlfriend and I said we'd clean up tomorrow. However, we did a quick inspection to make sure nothing was stolen. Her bag was gone completely this time, and so was one of my expensive watches. I rushed to our bedroom to pause the video cameras so I could download the footage and play it back. We started watching from the time guests started to arrive. I had it on fast forward, and we just skimmed all 3 cameras. Eventually, we noticed Tom's friend in the trench coat in the guest bedroom going through our stuff. I paused the footage in a fit of rage. I cut the footage to a 30-second clip, sent it to my phone, and then texted Tom immediately. I said, "Your friend stole stuff from my apartment, bro." He texted back, "Dude, no way." "What do you mean?" Then I sent him the footage. A minute later, he texted back, "Who the hell is that?" "I don't know who that is." I wrote back, "I was told that was your friend." Once again, he said, "Dude, I don't know that guy." My girlfriend and I got nervous now, so I went on a texting spree, texting all of my friends who came and asking if they knew that person. From everyone who was still awake, we got a bunch of no's. We went to finish the video footage, following the guy in the trench coat. He made his way into our bedroom, opened the door, then started dropping some of our belongings out the window, including my girlfriend's bag. I felt like the room was spinning, and my heart was in my throat. Then the man in the video quickly turned around, as if he heard someone coming up the stairs, and he crawled under the bed. We sped through the rest of the video footage, but he never got out from under the bed that we were currently sitting on, using the laptop. I saw the fear in my girlfriend's eyes and her temptation to scream, but I covered her mouth with my hand and whispered in her ear, "Run on the count of 3. But she couldn't help it. She let out a cry, so I had to yell at her to just run out of the room. I pushed her off the bed and followed close behind. I took a look under the bed before slamming the door shut, and I saw him down there, under the bed. We made eye contact. It was an indescribable moment. We called the cops in the kitchen, both grabbing big kitchen knives. The police made it to my condo in like 3 minutes, but by that time, the intruder was gone, and our bedroom window was once again open. He had escaped through the window and gotten away with our belongings. I handed over the video footage files to the police department, and they said they would review it and record an image of the man's face. Of course, he was never found, at least not by our local police department. Breaking the line. I don't know how long I was held in my watery prison. A month, a year, a decade. There was no way for me to measure time. 2 years before my death, I committed a terrible crime, and now I was suffering an ironic punishment courtesy of the demonic being who controlled this hellish realm. I'd been subjected to their twisted test, but the results were inconclusive, and so I'd been sent here to a sealed car at the bottom of a dark lake, left to rot while they considered my fate. I'd done everything I could think of to escape this hell, kicking against the windscreen until my leg ached, attempting to tear through the upholstery on the back seat, and trying to dismantle the car's interior with my bare hands. I worked frantically for hours until my hands were raw and bloody, but then I blinked, and everything was back to the way it was. I tried to end it all on a couple of occasions, smashing my head against the dashboard as I sought to crack my skull open. But it didn't matter how severely I injured myself. The same thing happened every time. I could not die, and whenever I regained consciousness, all my injuries were miraculously healed. They say hell is other people, but for me it was the tedium and loneliness. In the end, I gave up on all attempts at suicide or escape, and all I had was my thoughts. I don't know how long it took for my sanity to go. I would stare into the dark waters for hours or even days on end, and I started to see things, hideous monsters swimming along the bottom of the lake, glaring at me through the darkness with predatory eyes, and hungrily anticipating any opportunity to devour my flesh. There were times I would have gladly allowed the beasts to end me, but the glass between us was impenetrable. Other times I swore I got a glimpse of something in my rear mirror, jumping at the sight of a ghostly face in the back seat. Sometimes it was my ex-girlfriend Sally, other times my victim Milo, and on occasion I saw the dark-suited demon who had banished me here, an entity with swirling, vortex-like eyes, who scared me more than any other horror. Was I going mad, or were the demons just fucking with me? I couldn't tell, and ultimately I hardly even cared. All I wanted was for this hell to end. But as time passed, I began to lose hope, fearing that the demons had forgotten about me, and I'd be trapped here for all eternity. Therefore, I can't tell you the shock I experienced when, with the mere blink of an eye, I was transported to another place. My heart jumped as I looked through the cracked windscreen and saw the road ahead. I was still in the car, but the vehicle was no longer at the bottom of that cursed lake. Instead, the car was on an abandoned, narrow road at night, surrounded by darkened forest on either side, with the only illumination coming from the vehicle's headlights. I panicked, fearing I would drive off the road and into a tree. But nothing happened when I grabbed hold of the steering wheel and put my foot down on the brake. I had no control over the vehicle, which appeared to be self-driving. Taking a deep breath, I sat back in my seat and observed my new environment, realizing I was entirely helpless and at the whim of whatever hellish entity had me in their grasp. The car drove for what seemed like miles, the road twisting and cutting deeper into the dark and foreboding forest. I tried to focus on the road, fearing what I would see beyond the tree line, but on occasion I couldn't help but glance into the black abyss. When I did so, I swore I could see shadows moving through the woods, unidentified creatures with burning red eyes that watched me closely as I progressed through their dark realm. The road reminded me of the line, the queue of damned souls trapped between the light and the vortex. If that had been my first test, was this my second? If not, what the hell was the point of it? I soon got an answer, of sorts. My possessed car turned a corner and I came face to face with a horrific scene. There was another car parked on the side of the road, identical to the one I was in. That's not to say it was the same make and model, but rather an exact carbon copy, right down to the cracked windscreen and dent in the hood. My jaw dropped as my headlights illuminated two darkened figures at the rear of the parked vehicle, loading what was clearly a body into the trunk. The first was my doppelganger, an exact double, at first glance at least. And the second figure was Sally, my ex-girlfriend and accomplice in this crime. I was revisiting my worst moment, the night I killed Milo in a drunken hit-and-run and conspired with Sally to make his body disappear. I continued watching the ghoulish reenactment play out as my vehicle drove past the crash site. My doppelganger and the copy of Sally ignored my car until the last second, when they looked up and met my gaze, their eyes jet black like those of a shark. I turned away in shocked horror, focusing on the road as my car kept on driving. I couldn't look back, but this leg of my journey was almost complete. The forest on the right-hand side of the road gave way to a body of dark water, one which I recognized all too well. My heart sank as I feared the puppet masters would send me back to the lake's bottom. But this wasn't what happened. I spotted a boathouse by the lake's side, with a dim light emanating from within the wooden structure, and suddenly the car came to a stop by the side of the road, about 20 or 30 yards short of the boathouse. I heard a sudden click and was astonished to realize the car's doors were now unlocked. I couldn't quite believe that they were releasing me from my prison, and part of me feared a trick. I wanted time to consider my next move, but the situation quickly deteriorated. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, turning my head in time to see a large humanoid creature launching itself from the top branches of a tree, unveiling a large pair of wings as it screeched loudly and took flight. The shadowy monster disappeared from my line of sight for a moment. But then there was a heavy crash on top of my car as the creature landed. I screamed as the winged beast shrieked in excitement and started clawing at the roof. The creature was powerful, and its claws were more than capable of cutting through metal. I knew it wouldn't be long before it broke through, and I only had one chance. Opening the driver's door with a shaking hand, I jumped out of the car and started to run. I shouldn't have looked back over my shoulder, but couldn't help myself. The beast was a winged, gargoyle-like creature with an impressive wingspan, large and pointed ears, and burning demonic eyes. It continued to claw at the car's roof for a moment, unaware that I'd already escaped. But the beast soon realized its mistake, wailing like a banshee as it shot me a murderous glare, unveiled its wings, and took off. I kept on running, sprinting as fast as my legs would carry me. There was only one place I could go, the boathouse. I didn't think I'd make it, but somehow I covered the distance whilst the screeching beast raced towards me. I saw the door of the boathouse lying open and made straight for it, leaping the last few yards as the gargoyle descended, its claws only inches from my back. I landed heavily on the hardwood floor, darting up and slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't expect this to stop the beast, but to my astonishment, I watched through the door's portal-type window as the wailing gargoyle withdrew, flapping its wings as it retreated back towards the treetops. Breathing a deep sigh of relief, I turned around to face a fresh horror as I surveyed my surroundings. The interior of the boathouse took the form of a run-down dive bar, complete with sawdust on the floor and the stench of split alcohol and something much fouler. It was dark and dilapidated inside of the bar, and this certainly wasn't the type of venue I would have frequented during my drinking days. Nevertheless, the unpleasant interior of the bar room didn't concern me, at least not as much as the terrifying and familiar figure standing behind the bar. I stood frozen in awestruck horror as I observed the demonic entity casually cleaning glasses behind a blood-red counter, and with a bar stacked with label-less green bottles. He looked up when he saw me, his impossible vortex-like eyes placing me in a trance as I found myself under his dark spell. He formed his lips into a smile of sorts, although it certainly didn't put me at ease. And then he spoke in a deep, almost godlike voice. "Ah, Joshua, I'm so glad you could make it. You must be thirsty after your journey. Let me offer you a drink, on the house, of course." I was puzzled by the shadow man's words and unconvinced by his supposedly amicable welcome. The last time I'd spoken with this demon, he'd confined me to my watery prison, warning me that a far worse fate could await me. Naturally, I was terrified of the entity and wanted nothing to do with him. I certainly didn't want to accept a drink from this demon. Nevertheless, I was now entirely under the shadow man's control, and before I knew it, I was slowly walking towards the bar, my feet moving even though my brain was screaming, "Stop." I reached the bar but didn't dare to look into the shadow man's swirling and bewitching eyes. I kept my head down, focusing on the demon's accumulated dinner suit and bow tie, watching his bony hands as he grabbed 2 glasses and an unidentified green bottle from the top shelf. "Scotch on the rocks. That's your poison, right?" he asked. I opened my trembling lips, struggling to speak in response. I don't... But he didn't give me the chance to finish as he carefully poured 2 glasses of smooth whiskey and pushed them across the bar towards me. "Here you go, Joshua. 1 large whiskey for you, and the same for your friend over there." His bony finger pointed to the corner of the room, and I turned to face the figure sitting alone in a darkened booth, his head raised as he stared back at me. My heart beat fast in my chest, and my body trembled, but I can't say I was surprised. The dark eyes glaring towards me belonged to Milo, the man I'd killed 2 years ago before conspiring with Sally to dispose of his body. The last time I saw him, Milo was being dragged into the Shadowlands by a gang of bloodthirsty demons. I felt sure they would rip him to shreds, but yet here he was, sitting in the bar room and apparently waiting for me. I hesitated for a long moment as we locked eyes. I didn't want to go to Milo, but I couldn't run away from this. I'd done this man a great wrong, and now I needed to make amends, or at least attempt to do so. I took a deep breath, putting my head down as I walked across the sawdust-covered floor, my hands shaking as I struggled to keep hold of the 2 glasses. As I got closer, I could see Milo's mangled face, his forehead still covered in dried blood as it had been the last time I saw him. When Milo previously confronted us in the line, he'd attempted to throttle Sally and me in a mad fit of rage. I wondered whether he still desired revenge against me. I couldn't blame Milo if he did, but there was no way of predicting the ghoul's intentions from his cold, emotionless eyes. I stood over the table for a long moment, meeting his gaze and resisting the urge to recoil in disgust at his gruesome injuries. The tension was almost unbearable, and I found myself unable to speak. In the end, it was Milo who broke the silence, as he said, "Take a seat, Joshua." He pointed to the wooden bench on the opposite side of the table. I hesitated for only a second before sitting down and placing the 2 glasses on the table. Milo nodded his head before using his twisted right hand to awkwardly pick up his glass and hold it aloft. "Now then, Josh, how about taking a drink with me?" My jaw dropped as I looked down at the glass before me, feeling sick as I smelt the strong brown liquor contained within it. I glanced up at Milo's dead eyes, shaking my head vigorously as I spluttered out my response. I don't drink Milo. I gave up after—" "What?" Milo interjected impatiently. "You gave up the booze after killing me while drunk driving? Well, that hardly matters now, does it?" I broke eye contact with the ghoul, struggling to control my emotions as I continued staring at the glass. "I can't," was my pathetic reply. "I'm afraid I must insist, Joshua," answered Milo, as his tone suddenly turned hostile. I looked up and saw his pale and emaciated face screwed up with anger. I knew from previous experience how quickly Milo could lose his temper, and so submitted to his wishes, grasping my glass with a shaking hand and raising it up to meet that of my unlikely companion. "Cheers!" Milo exclaimed more amicably as he clinked his glass against mine. I watched as he downed his drink in one, pouring it down the gaping black hole that was his mouth. I paused for a second before following suit, coughing as the hard liquor forced its way down my throat. But then something extraordinary occurred. I felt a raw energy flowing through my veins, a burst of adrenaline which cut through my dread and gave me a renewed confidence and hope. And then I looked across the table and saw Milo transformed. He was no longer a mangled walking corpse. Instead, Milo was restored to his former self, the young, vibrant man he'd been before the accident and his untimely death. I was astonished and once again left speechless, but Milo simply smiled and shot me a wink as he said, "I think it's high time we had a heart-to-heart, don't you, Josh?" I nodded my head vigorously as tears welled up in my eyes. "I really am so sorry, Milo," I whimpered emotionally. I knew how inadequate my apology was, but Milo's reaction surprised me. "I know you're sorry, Joshua, but we're past that now." He sighed deeply, staring longingly at his now empty glass before continuing. "I'm guessing you have a lot of questions, and you're not going to get any answers from him." He nodded over to the shadow man who continued to wipe down glasses behind the bar, apparently disinterested in our conversation. "You know what's happening here, Milo?" I asked, feeling an unsettling sense of déjà vu as I did so. "I believe I have the answers you need," he answered cryptically. He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Meanwhile, I felt like my brain was on fire. I had so many questions it was difficult to know where to start, so I returned to the events of our last meeting. "I saw you die," I muttered nervously. "The demons took you." Milo shot me a sly half-smile before replying. "I was already dead, remember? The demons can hurt us. They can rip you to pieces. But you always come back. You pass out from the pain, and when you regain consciousness, you're right back where you started. That's the true hell, Joshua. To know there's no peace, no final release from all the pain and the fear." He broke eye contact, looking down at his empty glass and perhaps wishing it would magically refill. His words chilled me, but I reckoned Milo must be telling the truth. Still, there was so much I didn't understand. "The line," I said firmly. "I thought it was about salvation, about who makes it to paradise and who gets dragged to hell. But it wasn't that simple, was it?" Milo raised his head, appearing thoughtful for a moment as he looked over at the bar. There was a lengthy pause before he eventually replied. "It wasn't about salvation, but rather redemption. The purpose was to test us, to see how we'd react when backed against a wall." He turned to face me, a fiery intensity in his eyes as he spoke to me in a serious tone. "You've got to understand something, Joshua. The three of us are tied together. Ever since you ran me down that night, our fates have been intertwined. We three were tested in the line, and we all fell short." I shook my head in confusion. Perhaps I'm not the brightest, but none of this made any sense to me. "I can understand why Sally and I were punished," I exclaimed. "But why you, Milo? You were the wronged party." "True," Milo answered with a nod. "But my test was forgiveness, and I failed completely. I let hatred and a desire for revenge pollute my soul, and for that I'm sorry." I looked into his dark eyes with astonishment, not believing what I'd just heard. Milo was sorry for not forgiving me? I reckoned he had good cause to bear a grudge, but I guess that's not how it works in the afterlife. But still, I clearly wasn't the good guy in this story, and I had wronged Milo, not once, but twice. I failed in the line. I admitted, I should have made amends, but instead I threw you to the demons. Milo sighed deeply before replying, swallowing an old bitterness that he was trying hard to put behind him. "Yes, you failed on that score, but you did what was necessary to save Sally. You sacrificed yourself for her. That's the only reason you're not in hell right now." An ice-cold chill ran through me as I realized how close I'd come to eternal damnation. But this left me with an obvious question. "What about Sally?" I asked sheepishly. "Where is she?" Milo nodded ominously, like he'd been anticipating this very question. "Sally is in a bad place right now, but she's not beyond redemption. We can help her. Correction. We must help her." I thought Milo was joking, but when I looked him in the eye, I saw he was deadly serious. But why would Milo want to help Sally? She was my ex-girlfriend, the woman I'd once loved with all my heart. But my feelings towards her now were complicated. I didn't like the idea of her suffering, but couldn't forget how she'd behaved in the line, playing us both to save her own skin. I thought about concealing this fact from Milo, but there'd been too many lies already. "You know she lied," I muttered. "She lied to you, Milo." He didn't seem surprised by this revelation, and his reply confused me even further. "Sally lied about some things, but not about everything," he replied. "What do you mean?" I asked in puzzlement. Milo screwed up his face like he didn't understand my question. "You don't remember how you died?" he inquired cautiously. My brain ached as I desperately tried to think. I'd spent so long inside that damned car trying to recall the details of my death. There were fleeting memories, but nothing solid. As hard as I tried, I couldn't fill in the gaps. I remember being in a car, was my eventual and uncertain reply. I think I was in an accident? Milo looked visibly sad in that moment, as if he genuinely felt sympathy for me. You weren't in a car accident, he confirmed, but don't worry about that now. We've got to go. Go where? I asked, as my frustration grew. Go to get Sally. Milo replied firmly, she needs our help. And I promise you, Joshua, you'll find the answers you seek on our journey. Suddenly, Milo stood up from his chair and started walking towards the bar, briefly turning his head to look at me before he proceeded. I continued to sit in the booth, confused and uncertain, but realizing Milo wanted me to follow him. I was frightened by what lay ahead, yet I didn't want to stay here in limbo. I cast a glance towards the shadow man, avoiding the swirling orbs he had in the place of eyes. I didn't know whether I could trust Milo, but I sure as hell didn't want to stay here with him. And so, I stood up on shaking legs and cautiously followed in Milo's footsteps. I deliberately avoided the shadow man's gaze as I walked, but noted how he casually returned to the menial task of wiping down the bar top, while seemingly ignoring us both. But, as Milo and I passed the bar, he called out amicably to us, saying, "Good luck, gentlemen." Milo made for the back exit behind the bar, placing his fingers on the door handle before turning his head to face me, his expression still deadly serious as he delivered a stern warning. "Just remember one thing, Joshua. We have a specific mission, and we can't get distracted. We are both tied to Sally, and she's the one we're going in to save. We will encounter other lost souls during our odyssey, just like we did in the line. But we can't save them. They're all fighting their own battles, and will find their own way, in the end. Understand?" I nodded my head, even though I didn't fully comprehend the rules. I didn't know what lay ahead of me, but had little choice but to follow Milo's lead. We exited through the solid oak door, and were instantly hit by a stifling heat and heavy rain that fell upon our heads. It was still nighttime, but the vast body of water before us was dimly illuminated by the pale moonlight. But what drew my attention was the substantial island which sat to our north, upon which was built a medieval castle, with high defensive walls and a round tower easily 100 feet in height. I stared at that distant tower for a long moment, focusing on a dim light in a high-up window. I can't quite describe my feelings as I look upon that burning light. I'd been in many tough spots and witnessed many horrors, but I sensed there was an absolute evil inside of that tower, a monstrosity beyond my meager imagination, and it was watching us. I don't know how I knew this, but somehow I did. This dark entity was closely monitoring our progress through its realm, and it surely didn't welcome our presence here. I stood frozen under the biting rain, unable to divert my gaze from the ominous tower. I was conscious of a far-off storm that appeared to be heading in our direction, with distant thunder and flashes of lightning assaulting my senses. All my instincts told me to turn and run, but Milo gave me strength, grabbing my arm firmly and forcing me to look him in the eye. "We need to get to the island," he said firmly. "We've got to do this. For Sally." "For Sally," I repeated uncertainly as I looked away from the horizon and followed my unlikely ally down the slope leading to the lakeside. I saw a jetty leading out into the dark water. It appeared all too familiar, but I tried not to dwell on this. At the end of the dock was a small rowboat piloted by a dark figure clad from head to toe in black robes, his face hidden by a hood which covered his head. Milo walked down the jetty and towards the waiting boat, but naturally I hesitated, glaring suspiciously at the hooded figure as I questioned his intentions. Milo turned to face me, visually sighing as he noted my hesitation. "Come on, man," he exclaimed, raising his voice to be heard over the downpour. "This is the only way to cross the water." I took a deep breath before proceeding. We took our places on board the small boat, and I tried my hardest not to look at the hooded pilot as we cast off. I dreaded to imagine what he had hidden underneath his hood. I don't know how the boat propelled itself. We weren't rowing and there was no visible engine, but yet we moved steadily across the dark lake, slowly getting closer to the cursed isle. The lake's surface was bombarded by raindrops, but otherwise the water was still, at least at first. I looked down at the dark water and saw the first ripples. As yet unidentified creatures began to rise from the depths. I gasped when I saw the first of them, a rotting corpse, somehow still living despite the skin and flesh falling from its body. The zombie-like creature stank to high heaven, its dead eyes full of rage and hunger as it focused upon our boat and furiously swam towards us. I feared what the ghoul would do to us, but a moment later, a second corpse broke through to the surface, promptly attacking the first. Soon, the two zombies were tearing at each other with their bare hands and nails, roaring like wild animals, and slowly dismembering each other until the rotting remains sank beneath the surface. This scene was soon replicated across the lake and on all sides of our little boat, as dozens of moaning zombies emerged and violently fought against each other, ripping bodies to shreds and filling the lake with blood. A few managed to fight their way through the scrum of bodies, desperately approaching our boat with their arms outstretched. But our hooded pilot soon saw them off, hissing like a cat and scaring the dead, forcing them back underneath the water. After a while, I no longer feared the zombies. Instead, I pitied them. But I remembered Milo's words. We couldn't help these people and had to focus on our mission. Thankfully, we soon navigated through the Lake of the Dead, although our situation certainly didn't improve once we reached the island. The pilot would not land on the shore, and so we were forced to wade through the shallows to get to the beach. I didn't look back as the boat left us behind. We climbed the steep, muddy slope up from the beach, climbing to the top where we witnessed the monstrous castle in all its terrible glory. The high and thick walls were surrounded by a defensive moat, with a drawbridge allowing us to cross. The heavy gates lay open, but the castle was far from undefended. I looked up to the top of the walls, horrified to see winged monsters perched on the turrets, glaring down at us with murderous intent in their red, glowing eyes. I recognized the beasts, noting their close resemblance to the monster who'd attacked me in the forest. Except now there were many of them, 13 at my quick count, all watching us closely as we advanced towards the drawbridge. As always, I followed Milo's lead, but I sensed that he too was scared, noting how his body trembled as he avoided looking at the gargoyles. We reached the drawbridge and began walking across, our boots thumping on wooden planks as we struggled not to slip on the soaking wet surface. I made the mistake of looking down into the deep moat. In the dark waters below, I saw snapping beasts, trapped predators who surely sensed our presence above them, no doubt hoping Milo and I would slip and fall, so they could feast upon our warm flesh. But the unidentified monsters at the bottom of the moat weren't our primary concern. We were halfway across the bridge when we heard a terrifying screeching from above us. I fearfully glanced up in time to see several of the gargoyles taking off from the castle walls, extending their wings as they soared down towards us, their razor-sharp claws extended and their red eyes burning with a predatory zeal. "Run!" Milo screamed, as his cool demeanor broke down. I didn't need to be told twice, as I sprinted towards the castle's gate with Milo by my side, but I didn't think we'd make it. The lead gargoyle was only a few feet above me, wailing like a banshee as it prepared to dig its claws into my back. But suddenly I saw a projectile flying through the air, turning to watch as the bolt hit the winged monster in its right leg. The gargoyle shrieked in pain, abandoning its attack as it retreated, flying upwards and back to the safety of the battlements above. A moment later, a second bolt was fired, striking another monster and penetrating its pale flesh. Before long, all the gargoyles were retreating, aborting their assault under fire. I turned my head, looking back across the moat to see our savior. The figure illuminated by the moonlight was instantly recognizable. even though he had taken on a different form. The vortex-like orbs he had instead of eyes were a dead giveaway. It was the Shadow Man, except now he'd traded his tuxedo for a suit of armor and his bar rag for a crossbow. He nodded at me as he lowered his weapon, and I nodded back in thanks, although in truth I was very confused. For so long I'd believed this entity was my enemy, committed to punishing me for my sins. But now he'd saved us both. I looked to Milo, and I guess he read my mind, because he promptly offered me an explanation. He offers us protection, but it has its limits. We are permitted entry to the castle, but we'll need to work quickly. If we can't save Sally in time, all three of us will be trapped here forever. I stared at Milo in astonishment. How could he have kept this from me? What else did he know that he wasn't telling me? I was angry and scared, but also filled with a fiery determination. It's difficult to explain, but for so long my existence had been empty and without purpose. But now I had a mission, a chance at redemption. I was beginning to understand what Milo meant. I felt it deep inside of me, realizing that the three of us were tied together in death. We had to find Sally and bring her home. It was our only chance to avoid eternal damnation. We entered the gates without further incident, the wounded gargoyles cackling in annoyance as they watched us from the battlements. Once again, Milo led the way as we negotiated a series of narrow, twisting alleyways and advanced further into the castle's interior. My companion knew the way, and so I assumed he'd been here before. But Milo was clearly far from comfortable in this environment, his cool composure now gone as he frantically darted from shadow to shadow in an apparent attempt to remain unseen. I followed in his footsteps, noting how the rain had become even heavier, to the point where it physically hurt when it hit my skin. The storm was closer now, too, with the din of thunder near deafening and the lightning temporarily illuminating the tight alleyways before they returned to darkness. I occasionally glanced upwards at the foreboding tower which dominated the skyline, but I couldn't bear to look upon it for long. I could only hope that the evil which dwelled within was incapable of leaving. But the intensity of the weather and urgency of Milo's actions were concerning, to say the least. But before long, we emerged into an avenue at the foot of the tower and witnessed a horrifying scene. As the rain poured down, a line of lost souls trudged grimly through the puddles. Clad in soaked rags, their feet were bare and bodies emaciated. All their heads were down, and not one of the damned souls spoke or even acknowledged our presence in their hell. There was an obvious difference between this line and the one I'd previously experienced. All of the souls were moving constantly, albeit slowly, but they were literally going nowhere. The damned slowly walked the cobblestones on one side of the street before reaching the end of the cul-de-sac, at which point they turned around and walked down the other side. Turning again before repeating the process, they were walking in a circle and seemed to have been doing so for a long time. The waterlogged, cobblestoned street was surrounded on three sides by stone houses with open, glassless windows, and at the far end, dominating the entire avenue, was the round tower, home to God knows what. I shouldn't have done so, but I creaked my head upwards, looking at the flame burning on the top story of the tower. I only looked for a second, but observed a dark figure staring down at me. Its appearance was little more than a shadow set against a burning torch, but the mere sight of this entity provoked a chilling, primal terror deep within me, a fear which paralyzed me until Milo shook me back to reality, forcing me to look away. "Don't fucking do that!" he screamed frantically, his eyes filled with something close to madness. "Don't look at it, not even for a moment." We joined the line, pushing in between two damned souls who did not object. But as we passed by the row of stone houses, we bore witness to the true horror. Inside each small house, visible and exposed through the open windows, were blood-stained torture chambers filled with screaming, moaning victims. I saw naked bodies strung up by chains, strapped down to racks, and forced into Iron Maidens and other vile torture devices. And the torturers were foul demons, snarling, pale-skinned humanoids with hateful eyes and sharp claws that they gleefully used to slice into flesh and bone, cutting deep into their screaming victims without even a hint of mercy. I looked into the bloodshot eyes of the torture victims and saw nothing but pain, fear, and madness. I thought about trying to help them, but knew I couldn't. Milo had been clear on this, and so I looked away, trying in vain to ignore the screams and the awful sound of claws cutting through flesh. We joined the grim procession under the heavy rain as the thunderstorm closed in around us. We walked around in a circle 5 times, my nerves on edge as I felt myself slip to the edge of madness. I wondered why the others continued this endless, pointless march, but then I discovered why. Suddenly, just in front of us, one of the damned collapsed, crying aloud as he dropped to his knees. "I can't take it anymore," he screamed whilst looking up into the storm clouds. But there was no mercy in this realm. The line was held up behind him, but not for long. I saw a burst of movement in the corner of my eye, turning in time to see a demon reaching out through the open window and grabbing hold of the man, digging its claws deep into his flesh. "No, please God, no," the victim screamed, but it was over quickly. The demon dragged the screaming man, pulling him through the window and into the torture chamber, where he would surely join the other victims in eternal torment. Not a single soul in the line had attempted to save him. In fact, the damned didn't even react to his abduction. They simply walked on as if nothing had happened, trudging through the puddles with their heads down. At this point, I saw this place for the hell it was. The first line I'd walked through was terrifying and violent, but there was still hope in that realm. Rightly or wrongly, those trapped there believed they could escape and reach a better place, but there was no hope in this line. Here, the damned walked in circles for all eternity, without any chance of escape. They did so because the alternative was even worse. Those who fell would be dragged from the line and tortured by demons lurking inside the stone houses, subjected to pain and terror until madness overcame them. My heart sank, and I felt sick to my stomach. I now knew what this place was, but didn't understand what we were doing here. I put my hand on Milo's shoulder, making him turn his head as I shouted in his ear. "What the hell is this? You said we were here for Sally." "We are," Milo replied firmly. "Just wait." I was frustrated by yet another evasive answer, but trusted in Milo nonetheless. It was on our 13th circle of the street that the door suddenly shot open. I saw the entrance at the far end of the avenue, nothing how it was the only house on the street without windows, meaning we were unable to see whatever horrors occurred inside. I experienced a grim foreboding as we walked towards the dim candlelight, coming from the tiny house. But on some level, I knew that my destiny lay on the other side of that door. Whatever horror was inside was something I needed to face. The room we entered seemed comfortable at first. I was relieved to find sanctuary from the deluge. The smell inside was musky, but a vast improvement on the stinking corpses from the lake. The walls were bare, but there was an open fire burning in the corner, and I savored the warmth it provided. But what little comfort I felt was short-lived, because what we saw inside of that small room shook me to my very core. I spotted Milo staring blankly at the far corner of the room and slowly turned to face in that direction. My jaw dropped when I saw the woman sitting in a rocking chair, swinging back and forth whilst cradling a sobbing baby. Not a newborn, but a toddler aged about 1 or 1.5. I recognized the young woman straight away. It was Sally, the girl I'd once loved. I called out her name, but she did not respond. I was like she didn't even know we were there. Sally's brunette hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her face was drawn, and there were bags underneath her eyes. She looked exhausted, and yet her green eyes were full of joy and happiness as she comforted the child, singing a sweet lullaby as she gently rocked him back to sleep. I looked down at the baby boy in Sally's arms, and something clicked in my brain, but I still couldn't quite put the pieces together. I was desperately trying to think, but then a heartbreaking tragedy unfolded in front of my eyes. In a matter of seconds, the toddler's face drained of all color. His skin turned pale and then gray, before his tiny body dissolved into ash, literally falling apart in Sally's arms. But the true horror was my ex-girlfriend's reaction as Sally's world ended. She cried out the child's name as she collapsed to the floor. "Kevin, my baby boy, what have they done to you?" I saw the expression in her eyes turn from joy to devastation in a moment, and it was horrific. But what happened next was somehow even worse. In the blink of an eye, the previous scene was restored, as Kevin was brought back to life with Sally cradling him in her arms. She seemed to have no memory of the previous events, continuing to sing gently to the child while still ignoring the presence of Milo and me. But then the tragedy played out again, with Kevin disappearing into ash, while Sally cried out in pain. It was clear she was trapped in an eternal loop. This was her torture, to see the child under her care die in her arms over and over again, until she was eventually driven mad with grief. This was Sally's hell. The terrible truth should have been obvious, but still my brain couldn't quite connect the dots. There was a heavy roar of thunder from outside the open door which made me jump. The storm was right on top of us now, with the damned barely able to stand, let alone walk under the heavy wind and rain. I don't understand. Why is this happening? I asked, whilst looking to Milo. My companion lost all patience at this point, grabbing me roughly by the shoulders and shaking me vigorously as he screamed in my face. "For fuck's sake, Joshua, we don't have time for this. Look at the child's face. Really look, and you'll see the truth." I did so, focusing on the boy's deep blue eyes, which were almost identical to my own. And then it finally clicked. A wave of emotions and memories came flooding back, and I remembered the painful truth. Kevin was my son. Sally had left me 2 years before. Our relationship couldn't survive the shared guilt over Milo's death. She'd moved to the other side of the country and broke off all contact. The breakup was devastating for me at the time, but I did try to move on with my life. But what I didn't know was that Sally was carrying my child, a son I would never meet. I now remembered the phone call I received from Sally's father one rainy afternoon. I could tell from the tone of his voice that it was bad news. Sally was dead, killed instantly when her car was hit at an intersection by a long-haul truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel. She was killed instantly, as was Kevin, who was sitting on the child seat in the back. I attended the funeral, barely functioning as tears rolled down my cheeks, and I watched the 2 coffins being lowered into the ground, mother and son put to rest together. My grief was shared by Sally's parents, family, and friends, but I also felt an unbearable guilt, because I knew that Sally and Kevin would still be alive if it wasn't for the terrible mistake I'd made 2 years before. My life spiraled out of control immediately after the funeral. I started drinking again in an attempt to dull the pain, but it wasn't enough. I was plagued by nightmares of the accident that night, and of Sally and Kevin's terrifying final moments. I couldn't take it any longer. I did get into my car that night, but I didn't drive anywhere. My garage door was sealed shut when I turned on the engine, closing my eyes and allowing the toxic fumes to enter my lungs. I lost consciousness and slipped into eternal darkness, waking to find myself standing in the line, with almost no memory of the events which led to my death. I'd assumed Sally was lying when she spoke about our son, but this was only because I could not remember, as perhaps my brain had blocked out the trauma. Sally had changed some details, or perhaps her own memory was fuzzy. But now I could see her love for Kevin was genuine, and her grief at losing him was devastating I was still trying to process this revelation when my attention was drawn to the outside. Suddenly, a powerful bolt of lightning struck the street directly outside. The bolt was so bright that it temporarily blinded me, and the impact shattered the cobblestones, breaking the ground wide open as a deep crevice emerged, quickly expanding in size as screaming souls fell inside, plummeting down into the darkness. The buildings on each side of the street began to collapse as the huge crack grew, coming ever closer to the house we occupied while swallowing up everything in its path. Milo grabbed my arm so tightly that it hurt, and he screamed in my ear loud enough to be heard over the chaos. "It's now or never, Joshua. You need to get through to her. Do it now, or we're all fucked." I nodded my head, taking a deep breath as I turned to face my ex-girlfriend. Sally was oblivious to all the chaos occurring around her, continuing to rock and sing to Kevin, even as the whole world collapsed down upon our heads. Sally should have been dealt with delicately, but there was no time for this. I grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, shaking her until she acknowledged my presence. She cried out, looking up whilst grasping a tighter hold of Kevin, pulling him closer to her bosom. She took a moment to recognize me, as my sudden appearance in her world was entirely unexpected. "Joshua," she muttered weakly. "Josh, is it really you?" I bit my lip, attempting to ignore the turmoil outside the door as I tried desperately to bring my ex back to reality. "Yes, Sally, it's me. Now listen." "Josh," she interjected, still oblivious to the situation developing around her. "I'm so sorry, Josh. I should have told you the truth. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong." She paused, looking down at the still crying toddler in her arms. "Josh, this is your son, our beautiful baby boy." Masonry and debris were falling from the ceiling above me, and Milo was screaming in my ear. I had run out of time. "Sally," I cried, "that is not our son." She opened her mouth in dismay, replying angrily through trembling lips. "How dare you, Joshua? How dare you say that? Sally, we have a son, but that's not him. This is all a trick. You need to snap out of it right fucking now." "Fuck you," she swore, whilst tightening her grip on the baby. I'd reached the end of my teether and decided that direct action was required. It broke my heart, but there was no other choice. I reached out, grabbing at Kevin and pulling with all my strength. Sally reacted predictably, crying out as she desperately fought against me. "No. What are you doing? Let go," she exclaimed in dismay. But I couldn't do this. The struggle lasted for mere seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Sally fought with all her strength, but I was able to pry the baby from her arms, although her maternal screams brought a chill down my spine. I held Kevin in my arms for a brief moment, before his skin went gray and his tiny body turned to ashes, slipping through my fingers and falling to the ground. This event finally woke Sally from her trance, her eyes widening as she surveyed her surroundings. "What the hell?" she exclaimed in confusion. "Where am I?" Then she looked to the doorway and her face froze with horror. "Oh my God," she swore. I turned my head and saw what she meant. The street outside had now vanished, falling into the ever-expanding sinkhole that was swallowing up everything in its path. And the small room we occupied was collapsing around us, the ground shaking as we dodged huge slabs falling from the ceiling. I looked into Milo's eyes and saw nothing but blind terror. I'd completed the task assigned to me, but was it already too late? We all feared the worst, as the storm raged and the earth cracked open. But suddenly, I felt an intense heat on my back. Turning around, I saw a swirling vortex of blood red, identical to the one I'd been sucked into during my previous test. "Thank God," Milo exclaimed as he darted forward, leaping into the portal without a second's hesitation. I went to follow, knowing that whatever lay on the far side was surely better than here. But when I glanced across at Sally, I saw she was frozen to the spot, staring into the vortex with terror in her eyes. "I can't," she muttered fearfully. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," I shot back whilst grabbing hold of her hand and shooting her a reassuring smile. "We'll go together." She smiled back at me, and then we were running hand in hand, entering the vortex seconds before the ground collapsed. And then, the darkness consumed us. We're in a different place now. Not heaven or hell, but another version of purgatory where we must remain until our sins are absolved. This prison takes the form of a rundown apartment block set in the middle of a dark, monster-ridden hellscape. We are sealed inside of the building, and so are reasonably safe. Sally, Milo, and I are still bound together, forced to live on top of each other in this tiny flat. Our neighbors are a motley crew of bizarre individuals, all serving their own sentences for various sins committed in the mortal realm. The block warden is an odd man, helpful and friendly up to a point, although I sense a deep sadness in him and suspect he's on his own journey of redemption. This isn't a pleasant place to inhabit, and the three of us are often at each other's throats. But in a strange way, we three are like family now. And as bad as this complex can be, we know there are far worse realms we could be sent to. The Shadow Man continues to oversee us, communicating very occasionally through a one-way telephone installed in our apartment. We know there's still time to be served, and we're all willing to do so, if only because we have hope for the future. We may be dead, but we still have dreams. Milo is waiting for the wife he left behind, looking forward to their eventual reunion. As for Sally and me, our goal is to find our baby boy, to reach whatever level of the afterlife his innocent soul inhabits. When that day comes, we'll become the family we always should have been, and our past sins will be swept away. White Christmas. Living in Lower Alabama, we rarely receive snow. I spent most of my life wishing for a white Christmas that never came. I've only seen snow twice in my 33 years here. I always wanted to share that with my two boys. I just knew that they would love to play in it. Now I find myself staring out my window at the mounds of that icy precipitation surrounding my home, regretting every wish I had ever made for a snow-covered Christmas. When I think about it, it really started in summer. Our summers are always hot and extremely humid, but that year it was even more unbearable. We steadily saw temperatures of well over 100 degrees, and everyone I knew begged for relief. The heat wave lasted all the way until the week before Halloween. Then suddenly, a massive hurricane spawned in the Gulf of Mexico. The weather forecaster for our local news frequently referred to it as a monster. Looking back, I would believe it was more of a demon that brought hell with it, but a much different one than I had read about in the Bible. The storm passed, leaving devastation for miles around. It had affected every state within the Southeast, but Florida most of all. Help was sent from various utility companies, government aid agencies, and even regular citizens to help with the relief. And when I say various, I mean from every state in our region. It was amazing to see the effort put forth to help the people that had lost everything. I'm sure a lot of us thought that was the worst it could get. I wish that had been true, but that was when the rain started. As November came, we felt the first droplets in our tiny town. It was an odd occurrence, but not odd enough to raise any eyebrows. I mean, how bad could a couple days of rain be, right? The problem came when days turned into weeks, and low-lying areas became flooded. Homes and towns nearby were washed away in a matter of hours, once the levees broke. My wife Susan constantly thanked God that our house was nestled on a high elevation among trees. I found myself thinking the same thing. But God had nothing to do with what happened. No God I could ever believe in any way. The week of Thanksgiving, the rain finally subsided, and I am sure that was something everyone would say they were thankful for. The problem was, what remained was the cold. That, in itself, was not strange, but the severity of it was. We saw temperatures close to freezing for the following week, and that was something we rarely saw until late January or early February. My oldest son, Jacob, began singing that silly song by Bing Crosby. My wife beamed at the thought of them seeing snow on Christmas Day. The foolish child in me felt the same. "The boys will finally get to see snow, Paul," Susan squealed. "I know. I can't wait to see Tommy waddling in it," I responded. Those words ring in my head even now. I have to fight back tears when I think of just how stupid I had been. We were so preoccupied with setting up decorations and buying presents that we were oblivious to what was happening all around us. The snow actually started falling the first week of December. It was up several inches within the first day. It was amazing to see at first, but when it kept coming, some people became worried. If you have never been in the South when it snows, you probably would not understand. You see, we are not prepared for that kind of weather. Everything shuts down. People stay home and rarely go out driving. I know it sounds ridiculous to anyone else, but that is what happens. It just kept coming. My wife and I had let the boys play in the fresh powder originally, but when it had gotten so high that I could barely walk in it freely, we decided it was best to keep them indoors. Hardware stores had started bringing in snow shovels to help clear paths, something that you rarely found in our town. I bought one of the last ones on the shelf, as people scrambled to manage the icy foreign invader. The situation seemed to become worse, as small flurries became near blizzards. My wife stayed glued to the news and weather broadcasts. It appeared the northern states had almost been buried in the frigid powder. The president had actually issued a state of emergency, urging people in the northern portion to evacuate south. That was when I finally started to be concerned. These people had been told to come south, but our situation was hardly any better. The weatherman stopped trying to be accurate. His predictions of an end to the madness never came. The temperatures continued to drop, and it was not long before we saw them go from 0 to negative digits. It was unheard of in my state for it to be that cold, and people were getting afraid. Plumbing fixtures began to burst from frozen pipes, and people were left without water until they could thaw. Our world had become a freezer in a few weeks, and none of us were prepared for it. My family found themselves wearing our thickest clothing even inside. It felt like no matter how high I set the thermostat, it was not enough. We should have left then. By Christmas, we had no power, and utility companies had stopped trying to traverse the harsh conditions to repair downed lines. Local officials had abandoned emergency protocols to save themselves. We began hearing rumors of our neighbors attempting to head further south into Florida. Susan suggested the same, but I reminded her of the destruction still left from the hurricane. I was afraid we would be worse off without shelter. So, I made the decision to hunker down in our home. I cleared a path to the fireplace that had only been used for decoration and set to the task of getting a fire going. If it was not such a dire situation, my wife would have found amusement in me attempting something like that. I had never even seen someone use a fireplace, let alone light one. After several attempts, we were able to burn what little wood that was readily available near our home. My family and I huddled around it as if it were going to save us from the fate that waited outside. The whiteness had engulfed our home. The mounds had risen above the windows, breaking some of them. I was forced to reinforce each one to keep the cold out. We sealed every crack or crevice that could possibly let out the heat and tried to remain together. My wife wrapped our children in blankets and pulled them close. The boys did not understand, and we were afraid to tell them how serious the situation was. The fear that rested on my wife's face was enough to keep me from ruining what could be our last Christmas. We still attempted to have a big dinner, despite our ability to effectively cook. I also learned how to cook within a fireplace for the first time. It would have been an interesting experiment if it had not been essential for our survival at the time. We gave up on the idea of turkey or ham, but we had always had a decent stock of canned food. It was a habit I had picked up from my grandparents. I often wondered how they were faring during all of this, but I had my immediate family to worry about. Our world had been plunged into an endless sea of white. I even had nightmares of the stuff that Christmas Eve. My children normally woke me early on Christmas morning, but when my eyes fluttered open, I assumed it was still night. The house was so dark that I could barely see my wife lying next to me. I slowly rose from my bed, still completely clothed, and nudged Susan awake. The house had become far colder than it should have been, and I immediately headed for the fireplace. The fire had gone out at some point, so I ran for the back door, pulling on my boots. My aim was to gather more wood to get the fire going again, but as soon as the door cracked open, I was pelted with a mixture of snow and ice. It stung my face, and I cursed at the door while trying to shut it again. Our home had been buried in the vicious powder, and I finally understood why no light permeated the windows. My watch read 9 o'clock, but it felt much earlier. Susan stumbled into the living room, asking what I was doing. I told her what time it was, and confusion filled her eyes. She went for the window and was greeted with what I already knew. I do not remember ever seeing her quite so afraid, and the feeling was mutual. I buried my emotions down, though, knowing I had to be strong for my family. I told her to go check on the kids while I tried to get the fire going again. She disappeared down the hall, and I made my way to the dining room. The table and chairs had been passed down through my family for generations, but I knew it would have to be sacrificed. I set to dismantling the wooden chairs first, but was stopped by the sound of my wife's scream. I rushed through the hall, listening to the awful sound echo in my ears. I could feel tears forming in my eyes, but I pushed them back as I rounded the corner. She was grasping the doorframe of our children's room. We had put them together so that Jacob could help keep an eye on Tommy. I could see her body shaking as she stared into the room. Tears rolled over her cheeks as I turned to see inside. The window of their room had given to the weight of our captor, despite my attempt at strengthening it. Snow had buried the boys in the night, and that was when I noticed the flakes of white all over my wife's hands. Susan had attempted to uncover them, and I could see the pale blue skin of their faces, huddled together in Jacob's bed. It would have been a sweet scene if it were not for their skin tone, something Susan would have taken a picture of, but this was not that scene. I pulled Susan away as I tried to hold back the sick feeling in my stomach. I felt as though I could release what little Christmas dinner I had in me on the floor at any moment. Soon her sobs subsided, but when I looked into her eyes, she simply looked numb. I had never seen her this way, and I tried to break her from this trance she seemed to be in, but she said nothing. Her eyes would not even turn my direction when I spoke. Something had broken inside Susan that morning, and I do not blame her. I sat her next to the fireplace and wrapped her in a blanket while I returned to the dining room. The polished wood did not want to burn, but I was determined to give us warmth. So I did not stop until we had fire. I made it a point to ask Susan to stay by the fire while I returned to the boys' room. I could not leave them that way, but when I reached the door, I found myself pausing just outside. I felt the warm and salty specks across my cheeks before I even saw them. I slowly stepped inside and slid gloves over my hands. I finished clearing away the snow and noticed why they had not simply come to our room. The wood I had used to seal off the window had struck my oldest first. It left a gash near his temple that would have knocked a grown man unconscious. I could only imagine his 10-year-old body had not lasted long after. Tommy had obviously woken after. His tiny form clung to his big brother like a teddy bear. I internally cursed myself for not putting them to bed with us that night, but I knew it was too late for that kind of thinking. I removed their bodies and wrapped them in blankets before placing them in the guest room. I took one final look at their tiny bedroom. a place that had held so much joy previously. I imagined the two of them playing and sometimes bickering. My lips tried to curl upward, but they could not. My eyes drooped to the floor as I turned away and shut the door. I have not returned to that room since, and I doubt I will. I just returned to the living room in hopes of comforting Susan, but when I got there, the blanket was all that remained by the fire. A quick search of the house revealed that the back door had been opened, and a tunnel had formed in the frigid wall on the other side, leaving the floor inside covered in snow. I tried to follow Susan's footsteps, but eventually they disappeared behind a solid wall of that cursed white. I could only imagine her frantically digging through it, and the sound of what was above coming down upon her body. I tried to dig into it myself in search of her body, but the layer that remained was frozen solid. It was like digging my hands into cement, and I knew that Susan could not have survived it, even if my mind did not want to believe it at the time. I found myself picking at it with tools anyway, feeling as though I had nothing left to do. I do not know how much I cried while working at that pointless task, but I do know it started to freeze to my cheeks. I did not stop until my arms could not lift again, and that is when I sat among the snow and stared at what my world had become. I lost track of how long I sat there, or when I decided to come back to the fire. I do remember when I started burning the Christmas gifts and how hard a choice that had been. I opened each one slowly and savored the idea of the children playing with it for the first time. I could even see Susan standing over them with her camera in hand. She would be giving her biggest smile and snapping away to save each memory. She loved taking pictures, but what I had to do did not need to be captured on any sort of film. I started to feel the numbness that night, that same numbness that overtook Susan earlier that day. It was as cold as the snow that surrounded me, and all I could think was this had been my fault. I should have escaped with my family when I still had the chance. I do not know if it was pride, ignorance, or both, but the guilt was too much. It consumed me and took away everything this holiday was supposed to be about. I started writing this in hopes that someone reads it. I do not know what has happened to the rest of the world, only what has happened to me. I do not know how long I can survive here. My food is running low, and I have run out of things to burn. I cannot even say for certain how long I have been here since my watch has stopped turning, and I still cannot see the sun. I think I will try to dig myself out tomorrow, and if you do find this, know I did not simply give up. I just wish I had done this sooner. I am so sorry, Susan, Jacob, and Tommy. You deserved better than this. I hope you can forgive me. Sincerely, Paul Richardson. Now to the next story. Story number 2. A heartwarming Christmas tale. And to this day, Marie should still be the queen of a country in which shimmering Christmas forests and glazed marzipan castles, in short, the most marvelous things you can imagine, can be seen if you only look. The end. With a sigh, little Timmy slowly closes the book, gets up and places it on his corner of books, as his mother calls the pile at the corner of the room where Timmy puts his books. "Did you finish that already, honey?" "Yeah," Timmy responds, his soft voice trembling from the cold. "Did you like it?" "I will take you to the bookshop to get another one for the holidays when the weather becomes better," Timmy's mother says, before she is struck by a coughing fit. It has been snowing heavily for days now, and the two of them have been trapped in their home, while the old stove in the basement has broken down and there is no heating in the house. "It's okay, Mom. I don't need one right now." Timmy, despite his young age, knows his mother doesn't have much money and doesn't want to put pressure on her. He jumps on the couch next to his mother, and she strokes his hair affectionately as the two of them huddle together to fight off the growing cold. During the night, it is just past midnight, and little Timmy is laying on his bed, tightly clutching his raggedy blanket close to his chest. He is having trouble going to sleep. His mother's muffled crying and raspy coughing can be heard through the wall. He pulls the blanket over his head to fend off both the lingering cold and his mother's suffering. "Having trouble sleeping, little one?" A voice speaks up from the foot of the bed. With a swift move, a wooden nutcracker toy soldier climbs onto the bed and sits on little Timmy's leg. Little Timmy peeks out from under the blanket. "Hi, Alexandra," the boy says with a frail voice. "Worried about your mother, huh?" the toy soldier says, readjusting the wooden hat on his wooden head. Little Timmy nods in agreement. "She is having a rough night, isn't she?" Alexandra pauses for a second. "But I heard you just finished your book. How was it?" "It was good." You are not in the mood for talking, eh?" Alexandra scratches off a wood chip from his knee. He looks sternly at little Timmy. "Tell you what, lad, I will take care of this. I will go down at the basement and see what I can do about the stove." "I want to help too," little Timmy says, his voice stronger. "That's the spirit, lad. Have a good night's sleep now." With that, Alexandra takes a bow and jumps off the bed. Little Timmy is very glad he has Alexandra. He is shy, sickly, and small in frame, and he doesn't have many he can call friends. Alexandra is there for him ever since he can remember, taking care of him since he was young. These thoughts float in Timmy's mind as he falls into the warm embrace of a deep sleep. Morning comes. Little Timmy spends the day taking care of his mother. He cleans around the house, cooks and caters to her needs. Her condition has worsened during the night. She is feverish and can't stop coughing. She is stuck to her bed for the whole day. To keep her warm, Timmy gave her his blanket, no matter how she refused. Still, the house is terribly cold, and the stove remains broken. Night falls again. Timmy bids his mother good night and goes for his bed. He has no blanket. Instead, he uses the heaviest clothes he could find in his wardrobe. Still, the cold is stinging and harsh. With a trembling breath, he lays down and closes his eyes. "Psst, lad, are you asleep?" Alexandra opens the toy's chest and walks slowly towards the bed. Little Timmy groggily opens his eyes. The mustachioed face of the soldier greets him. "Sorry to wake you up, but I think I found what the problem with the stove is. The basement is covered in snow." "In snow? How?" Timmy's timid voice speaks out. "There is snow everywhere. On the floor, the shelves, everywhere I say." How is this Timmy's sentence is interrupted by heavy coughing from his mother's room. Alexandra looks at little Timmy stoically. "Tomorrow I will go down there and take care of it. Do not worry, lad." The toy soldier tries to soothe Timmy. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming shut echoes across the house. Little Timmy gasps. "Must have been the wind," Alexandra says. Then, just outside the room, footsteps. Slow, unsteady footsteps, like someone is dragging his feet. Little Timmy hides under the covers, while Alexander stands up. The footsteps abruptly stop. The door to the mother's room creaks open. The footsteps resume. Someone has entered the room. "Stay here, lad," Alexander whispers to little Timmy before he jumps down the bed and goes for the door. He jumps to the handle and pulls it down, but the door does not open. "Locked?" The door to the mother's room closes shut. Timmy starts sobbing lightly. Alexandra frantically jumps around the room, trying to find the key. Then, from the mother's room, a loud moan. "Mommy!" Timmy cries. Alexandra is livid, eyes darting around and mind racing for a way out. The moans get louder and louder until they suddenly stop, replaced by rhythmic wheezing. Alexandra moves a stool under the handle, climbs on and jams his metal sword in the lock, and frantically moves it around. The door clicks open, and the toy soldier jumps out, his wooden boots clacking across the cold floor. He runs to the mother's room, but as he reaches the door, it swings open, and a wild gust of wind blows into the hallway. lifting Alexandra and slamming him against the wall. Then, an eerie silence falls upon the house. Only the muffled crying of little Timmy and the heavy breathing of the mother disturb the stillness of the cold night. The weak morning sun rays break through the dark clouds. "Mommy, Mommy, please wake up," little Timmy begs his mother. She has grown deathly pale and she is very cold. She is breathing with difficulty and she is shaking. "I warmed you some milk, please drink it, it will do you good." But she does not respond, lost deep into feverish dreams. Little Timmy places the glass of milk on the nightstand and turns to leave. He has a lot of housework to do. During the day, though, he takes great care to stay away from the basement door. The moon shines brightly in the sky. "Lad, is everything all right?" Alexandra jumps from the toy's chest and sits on the windowsill, next to little Timmy, who has been staring out of the window for the past hour. Alexandra's left hand is bruised and its red paint is scratched off, while a button is missing from his torso from the scuffle last night. "I gathered some wood and dry branches. I will light the old stove and we will be warm again." What about the thing?" "Don't be scared, little Timmy. Alexandra will take care of it," the toy soldier says with a warm smile. "Anyway, I see you started writing the story you were telling me about," he says, pointing at the notebook by the nightstand. "How is it going?" "This must be fun." "It's great. I'm at the part where Jack sneaks into the Mouse King's castle to save Eliza. Oh, I am so eager to read it. Jack sounds like a very fine lad. He is very brave, but he is not as brave as his guardian," little Timmy says, his gaze wandering off in the distance. Alexandra sighs. "I'll go fire the stove up for a moment and then I'll return to talk about your story more, all right, lad?" Little Timmy gives Alexandra a fleeting, nervous glance, and Alexandra bows his head and backs away. An hour has passed, and Alexandra still hasn't returned, nor is the stove lit. Little Timmy is growing more anxious by the minute. He fears the worst. Thinking of what Alexandra would do for him, he decides to go to the basement. With trembling hands, he opens the door. His mother is fast asleep. Little Timmy covers her exposed to the cold body with her blankets and starts the long walk towards the basement. Time seems to have stopped while Timmy makes his way to the basement door. The incessant wind has ceased blowing, and the house is plunged into complete silence. He takes a deep breath and with shaking hands reaches for the doorknob. The old door opens, the rusty hinges groaning under the weight of the metal door. The cold breath of the darkness below hits little Timmy in the face. For a moment his will falters, but he steels himself and pushes his legs down the slippery stairs, the open, dark mouth of the basement below staring back into his little heart. Slowly but steadily, little Timmy descends into the abyss. The further down he goes, the colder and darker it gets. Snow and ice have formed on the stairs. Then Timmy reaches the floor of the basement. He gets on his toes to reach the light switch, but it is completely frozen and stuck in place. Darkness and cold envelop the little boy. In front of him stands the old stove, asleep and dormant. All the boxes and old shelves around it are just shadows in the dark. Alexandra, though, is nowhere to be seen. Timidly, little Timmy takes a step forward. As soon as his foot lands, a gust of wind blows from the back of the basement, swirling snow and stuff around. Timmy covers himself as best as he can. When the ruckus stops, a tall white silhouette stands in the middle of the room. The man-like creature is crouched over, its thin torso almost floating on its lean limbs. Its skin has a parch-like texture and breaks up here and there. The creature sniffs the air and turns towards Timmy. Its black eyes meet with his as the creature starts to move towards Timmy, who can only watch paralyzed. "Over here!" Alexandra's voice echoes in the basement, pulling Timmy out of his trance. Little Timmy follows the voice and finds the toy soldier hiding under a shelf, a pile of wood by his side. He is in a very dire state. His torso is cracked, wooden splinters spurting out from his body, and his right leg is severed from the knee down. To stand up, he is using a branch as a crutch. We don't have much time. You need to go and put the wood into the stove. That will drive the creature away and heat the house. I will distract him. Quickly. Alexandra starts hopping to the other side of the room while little Timmy grabs the wood and branches and sneaks his way to the stove. "Over here, you big snowflake!" Alexandra shouts at the creature, which turns and gallops toward him, its bony spine arched back and his sharp claws clicking on the floor. Little Timmy is halfway to the stove, but he slips, and the branches scatter across the floor with a loud noise. The creature stops in its tracks and turns towards the boy. It glances at the pile of wood on the floor and then the stove. With a gritty laugh, it grabs the wood, which dissolves under its touch. It then moves closer to Timmy, who backs away as fast as he can. Alexandra sprints as fast as his one leg allows and gets between the creature and Timmy. "Over my dead body," the soldier says, unsheathing his sword and staring down the vile beast. The beast falls on all fours and slowly prowls towards Alexander, who stands tall, its shoulder blades bobbing up and down. It stops right in front of the soldier and looks down on him, its black eyes examining the little thing that stands between it and its prey. Alexander assumes a defensive stance. The beast goes to move over him to little Timmy, uninterested in the soldier. Alexandra strikes its arm with 2 quick slashes, and 2 red streaks splatter across the floor. The beast lets out an angry cry. The soldier moves back on the defensive and steadies himself. "For little Timmy, be strong for little Timmy," he whispers under his breath. The beast lets out another bone-chilling cry and stands on its feet. When it comes back down, it strikes at Alexandra, throwing him to the side. His head hits the hard wall, his hat splintering into 1,000 pieces and his sword thrown way out of his reach. The last thing the soldier sees before his strength leaves him is the creature lunging towards little Timmy, who screams in fear. Alexandra's eyes close, and his world fades to black. Little Timmy is now backed against the corner of the basement, clutching a box as a shield in front of him. The creature tears the box apart. Little Timmy starts crying as the creature grabs his leg. The creature smashes Timmy against some cardboard boxes. Before it can grab him again, little Timmy opens his tearful eyes. On the opening of the stove stands Alexandra. Both his legs are broken off. Half his torso is gone and his head is cracked. Somehow he managed to climb on the stove. Below him on the floor where he crawled are wood splinters and parts of the toy soldier. "You made it," little Timmy thinks as his heart is filled with new hope. The eyes of Alexandra meet with little Timmy's. The wooden nutcracker toy soldier smiles warmly. "I will take care of it, lad. I promised." With that, Alexandra pushes himself into the old stove, which flares up in powerful red flames. A blinding white light shoots out, and the wave of heat that follows shakes the foundations of the whole room. First, the stalactites quickly melt off, and the snow evaporates into mist. Then the wave engulfs the creature, its white skin catching fire like old parchment. It lets out a scream of agony, flames shooting out from its body. A big hole of fire opens up in its chest as it falls to its knees. It looks at its hands as they are burned off its body, shattering and evaporating upon hitting the floor. The creature finally vaporizes into a dark smoke. Only little Timmy now stands in the basement. After he collects himself, he shakily exits the basement. The house is now warm. He walks into his mother's room. The mother is sat upwards on the bed, calmly drinking the warm milk Timmy made her earlier. Little Timmy runs to her and gives her a hug. In his warm, starlit room, little Timmy finishes writing his story. He gets up from his desk and walks towards his toys chest. He carefully places the notebook on the wooden box. With the Mouse King defeated, Jack and Eliza lived happily ever after. with Alex always watching them from above, smiling warmly. Jack's ever-loving guardian.